Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtains on history's worst-kept secrets. The royal love affairs that shook thrones, toppled empires, and proved that even monarchs with absolute power were absolutely powerless against their own hearts. We're talking beheadings over bedroom drama, queens losing crowns for the wrong lover, and scandals so juicy they'd make modern tabloids look boring. Forget the fairy tales. Tonight's lineup includes a king who married 6 times and still couldn't get it right, a virgin queen who weaponized flirtation like a military strategy, and a princess who turned her messy love life into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Before we dive into centuries of royal chaos, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's joining me on this journey through history's most spectacular romantic disasters. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tour through the scandals they definitely didn't teach you in school. Because when you're born wearing a crown, love isn't just complicated, it's downright dangerous. Let's roll. So let's kick things off with the granddaddy of all royal romantic disasters, Henry VIII and the absolute carnival of chaos that was the Tudor court. Now when you think about Henry, you probably picture that famous portrait, right? The one where he's standing there looking like he ate an entire castle and is about to demand another one. But here's the thing, this man didn't just revolutionize English religion and politics. He basically turned romantic relationships into a full-contact sport where the penalties included, well, losing your head. Literally. The Tudor court wasn't just a place where policy happened. It was essentially a pressure cooker of ambition, desire, power plays, and extremely poor life choices, all wrapped up in velvet and jewels. And at the centre of it all was a king who somehow managed to convince himself that each new marriage would be different from the last, which is roughly the equivalent of someone burning down their house 6 times and insisting that the 7th time they'll definitely remember to turn off the stove. But before we dive into the parade of wives, and trust me, we're going to dive deep, we need to understand what made the Tudor court such a uniquely dangerous place to fall in love, or more accurately, to be fallen in love with by a king who had the emotional maturity of a toddler with nuclear weapons. This was a world where a well-placed smile could make your family's fortune, and a poorly timed rejection could lead to your entire bloodline getting erased from the history books. No pressure though. Let's start with the Boleyn sisters, because if there's any family that represents the absolute insanity of playing the Tudor dating game, it's them. Mary and Anne Boleyn, 2 sisters who both ended up in the king's bed, with wildly different outcomes, though honestly neither of them won any prizes in the end. Their story is basically a masterclass in how power, sexuality and politics got so tangled up at the Tudor court that you needed a flowchart just to figure out who was betraying whom on any given Tuesday. Mary Boleyn was the older sister, and by most accounts she was the easier-going one. Not exactly someone who was plotting world domination from her cradle, if you know what I mean. She ended up at the French court first, serving Queen Claude, and apparently made quite an impression there, though impression might be a polite way of putting it. The French court had a certain reputation, let's say, and Mary fit right in. King Francis III of France allegedly called her the English mare, and suggested she was rather more available than the Spanish ambassador's daughter, which tells you everything you need to know about both Mary's reputation and the charming way 16th century monarchs talked about women. When Mary came back to England, she joined the court of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who at this point had no idea she was training her own replacement, or rather, her replacement's sister. Mary caught Henry's eye sometime around 1522, and honestly, catching Henry's eye wasn't exactly an achievement requiring great effort. The man had the attention span of a golden retriever at a tennis ball factory. What made Mary notable was that she apparently kept his attention for a good few years, which in Henry VIII terms was basically a lifetime commitment. Now here's where it gets interesting. Nobody knows exactly how long the affair lasted, or what Mary actually got out of it. There's no evidence Henry showered her with titles or lands, or made her children legitimate, or did any of the things he'd later do for other women. She was essentially a side piece who got the royal attention without any of the benefits, which is possibly the worst deal in mistress history. It's like winning a contest where the prize is more work and no pay. Congratulations, you played yourself. But Mary's real significance isn't her relationship with Henry, it's what happened next. Because while Mary was being quietly dismissed from Henry's affections, her younger sister Anne was watching and taking notes. Very careful notes, as it turned out. Anne Boleyn was a completely different animal from her sister. If Mary was the easygoing golden retriever of the family, Anne was the calculating chess master who could see 12 moves ahead and wasn't afraid to knock over the board if she didn't like where the game was going. She'd spent time at the French and Habsburg courts, learning the art of courtly love, that delicate dance of flirtation and power that was essentially the 16th century's version of corporate networking, except with more jewels and a significantly higher mortality rate. Anne returned to England around 1522 and quickly established herself as one of the most fascinating women at court, which was not an easy achievement in a place absolutely crawling with ambitious young women trying to catch the eye of wealthy nobles. She was witty, cultured, could hold her own in religious and political debates, played music beautifully, and had this magnetic quality that made people pay attention when she entered a room. She was also, by the standards of her day, not conventionally beautiful. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an era that preferred blondes, and supposedly had a small extra fingernail on one hand that enemies would later claim was a sign of witchcraft, because apparently in the 16th century, having a minor birth defect meant you were definitely in league with Satan. Henry noticed Anne around 1526, and at first it probably looked like Mary Boleyn 2.0, another Boleyn girl for the royal collection. But Anne had watched what happened to her sister. She'd seen Mary get used up and tossed aside with nothing to show for it, but some memories and possibly some very awkward family dinners. So when Henry came calling with that special blend of royal entitlement and middle-aged desperation, Anne did something revolutionary. She said no. Well, not exactly no. More like not until there's a ring on it, and not just any ring, a queen's ring, which was, to put it mildly, an absolutely insane demand. Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the people who financed Columbus and kicked the Moors out of Spain. Catherine had been Queen of England for nearly 20 years. She had powerful family connections across Europe. And perhaps most importantly, she hadn't done anything wrong except fail to produce a living male heir, which wasn't exactly her fault given that this was centuries before anyone understood that the man's contribution determined the baby's sex. But Henry, being Henry, was convinced this was somehow all Catherine's fault and that God was punishing him by not giving him sons. Anne's refusal to become just another mistress set off a chain of events that would literally reshape England. Henry became obsessed, and when I say obsessed, I mean he wrote her love letters that still survive today, including one where he signed himself as her servant, with a heart drawn around his initials, which is either touching or deeply disturbing depending on how you feel about monarchs who later beheaded their wives acting like lovesick teenagers. The letters show a man absolutely convinced that Anne Boleyn was his destiny, his future, the answer to all his problems. She was going to give him sons. She was going to be his perfect queen. She was going to make everything right. Spoiler alert, she was not going to do any of those things, but Henry had never been great at predicting outcomes. The whole Anne Boleyn situation dragged on for years, 6 years to be precise, which must have felt like an eternity for everyone involved. Henry tried to get the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. The Pope, who was currently being held prisoner by Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, unsurprisingly declined to piss off his captor by declaring the Emperor's aunt's marriage invalid. Henry tried every argument he could think of. The marriage was invalid because Catherine had briefly been married to his older brother Arthur. God was punishing him. Catherine was too old to have more children, and so on. None of it worked. Meanwhile, Anne was in this bizarre limbo state where she was essentially queen-in-waiting, but not actually queen, which meant she got all the hatred from people loyal to Catherine, but none of the actual power of the position. People called her the concubine, and worse. Religious hardliners saw her as a heretic corrupting the king. She was known to have reformist religious sympathies, which in this era meant she thought maybe people should be allowed to read the Bible in English, and perhaps the Pope wasn't quite as infallible as advertised. The common people who loved Catherine absolutely despised Anne. There were reportedly women who yelled insults at her in the street, which must have been a fun experience for someone who was supposed to be preparing for queenship. But Anne held firm, and Henry's obsession only grew stronger. Finally, in 1533, Henry took the nuclear option. He broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, had his marriage to Catherine annulled by his own newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony. Anne was already pregnant at this point. Apparently after holding out for 6 years, she'd finally decided that Henry's promises were legitimate enough, or possibly she just got tired of waiting and figured she'd take her chances. Either way, she was crowned Queen of England in June 1533 in a lavish ceremony that cost a fortune, and that most of the nobility attended while mentally composing angry letters to their relatives about the outrage of it all. And then Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son Henry was so desperately counting on. Not the male heir that this entire constitutional crisis had supposedly been about. A girl. Now let's pause here and appreciate the absolute tragedy of this moment. Elizabeth would go on to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history, the Virgin Queen who would define an entire era and turn England into a global power. But in September 1533, she was just a disappointing girl baby who represented everything that had gone wrong with Henry's grand plan. Anne had one job in Henry's mind and she'd failed at it. Never mind that producing a male child was biologically out of Anne's control. Never mind that Henry himself had only managed to father one legitimate son with Catherine, who died shortly after birth, and that the sex of the child was determined by the father's contribution anyway. None of that mattered. What mattered was that Henry had destroyed his first marriage, broken with the Catholic Church, and made himself the most hated man in Europe for a woman who'd just given him another daughter. The clock was ticking from that moment on, though Anne didn't know it yet. She tried again, of course. Got pregnant again. Miscarried. Got pregnant once more. Miscarried again, reportedly of a son, which must have been absolutely devastating. Meanwhile, Henry's eye was already wandering because that's what Henry's eye did best. The obsessive love letters had stopped. The constant attention had evaporated. Henry was starting to look at Anne the way he'd looked at Catherine, as an obstacle to his happiness rather than the source of it. And into this increasingly toxic situation walked Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, because apparently loyalty meant absolutely nothing at the Tudor court if there was a crown up for grabs. Jane was everything Anne wasn't: meek, mild, obedient, blonde, and from good English stock rather than being an ambitious social climber. She also had brothers who were very, very good at court politics, and who could see which way the wind was blowing. The Seymour family began positioning Jane as the anti-Anne, the woman who would restore traditional values and give Henry his son, because everyone was still operating under the delusion that the next woman would definitely, absolutely, no question fix everything. By early 1536, Henry had decided he was done with Anne. Not just done like let's get a divorce done, but done like she needs to die done. Because here's the thing about Henry VIII. Once he turned on you, he went all the way. There would be no quiet annulment for Anne. No peaceful retirement to a convent. Henry wanted her dead, and he wanted it to be her fault, not his, because he couldn't handle being the bad guy in his own narrative. So his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, cooked up a plot that was so absurd it would be rejected from a bad soap opera. Anne was arrested and charged with adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. She was also charged with plotting to kill the king, which apparently she was going to do right after finishing up her busy schedule of allegedly sleeping with half the court. The charges were ridiculous. The evidence was non-existent or extracted through torture. The timeline didn't even make sense. She was supposedly conducting multiple affairs during times when she was visibly pregnant or had just given birth, because apparently in Henry's mind, Anne had superhuman energy levels in addition to her treasonous activities. But none of that mattered. This wasn't about truth. This was about Henry wanting to be free to marry Jane Seymour, and about making sure Anne was so thoroughly destroyed that no one would question the legitimacy of his next marriage. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Anne was found guilty by a jury of peers who knew exactly what Henry wanted them to decide, because voting to acquit the Queen on charges the King had brought was a great way to end up on trial yourself. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536 on Tower Green. She'd been Queen of England for exactly 3 years. She made a speech before her execution where she praised the king and asked people to pray for her, because even facing death she knew better than to give Henry's propaganda machine any ammunition. The executioner used a sword rather than an axe, which was considered a mercy. Anne had specifically requested a skilled swordsman from France, and Henry granted her that much at least. Her last words were reportedly about hoping her death would be quick, which it was. One stroke and Anne Boleyn, the woman who'd caused a religious revolution, was gone. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. 11 days? That's less time than it takes most people to get over a bad cold, and Henry had moved on from the woman he'd restructured his entire kingdom to marry. The speed of it was shocking even by Tudor standards, where people were generally pretty used to Henry's nonsense by this point. But we're not done with the Tudors' deadly romance carousel, because we need to talk about Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's first cousin, and the proof that the Boleyn family had absolutely learned nothing from Anne's execution. Catherine Howard was young, probably around 19 when she married Henry, though records are unclear and she might have been even younger. Henry was 49, overweight, with a suppurating ulcer on his leg that smelled so bad people could reportedly detect his presence before they saw him. This was not exactly a fairy tale romance, is what I'm saying. Catherine came from the powerful Howard family, the same family that had produced Anne Boleyn's mother. She'd been placed at court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, who he'd married sight unseen based on a flattering portrait, and divorced 6 months later when he decided she looked like a Flanders mare, which was both incredibly rude and also rich coming from a man who looked like Henry VIII at this point in his life. But that's another story. Catherine caught Henry's eye because she was young, pretty, vivacious, and represented a return to his youth, or at least that's what Henry convinced himself. She was everything that made him feel young again, which is a deeply disturbing thing when you remember that he was literally old enough to be her grandfather. The Howard family pushed the match because they saw an opportunity to regain influence at court after Anne Boleyn's disgrace. Catherine herself probably didn't have much choice in the matter. When the King of England wants to marry you, no thank you isn't really an option, even if the king in question is a walking health crisis who's already beheaded 2 wives. They married in July 1540, and Henry was initially besotted with his rose without a thorn, which was his nauseatingly sweet nickname for Catherine. He showered her with gifts, jewels, lands, and attention. For a brief moment it looked like maybe this marriage would work out, if only because Catherine was too young and inexperienced to do anything that would anger Henry. But here's where Catherine's youth and inexperience became a massive problem. She'd grown up in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was minimal and teenage girls were largely left to their own devices. Before she ever met Henry, Catherine had been involved with her music teacher, Henry Manox, and then had a serious relationship with Francis Dereham, a gentleman of the household. These weren't just innocent flirtations. By most accounts, Catherine and Dereham had engaged in what the Tudor era politely called carnal knowledge, and there was even talk that they'd been pre-contracted to marry, which in Tudor terms was basically as binding as an actual marriage. When Catherine became queen, both Manox and Dereham thought they could leverage their previous relationships with her to get positions at court, because everyone in this era had the survival instincts of a lemming. Dereham particularly pushed his way into Catherine's household, becoming her private secretary, which was the equivalent of hanging a giant sign around his neck that said, "I have dirt on the Queen, please investigate me." But it gets worse, because Catherine wasn't content with the extremely dangerous situation of having her ex-lovers hanging around. She began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. This was jaw-droppingly stupid for several reasons. First, she was the Queen, and queens being unfaithful was literally treason. Second, she was married to a man who'd already beheaded one wife for alleged adultery. Third, Culpeper was close to the king, and the affair required the help of Lady Rochford, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, who apparently hadn't learned anything from watching Anne lose her head. And fourth, Catherine and Culpeper were meeting secretly while the court was on progress, which meant trying to conduct a clandestine affair while living in a travelling circus of hundreds of people, any one of whom could have discovered them. Unsurprisingly, they got caught. Actually, that's not quite accurate. They didn't get caught in the act. What happened was that a Protestant reformer named John Lascelles told Archbishop Cranmer about Catherine's premarital relationships, probably hoping to damage the powerful Catholic Howard family. Cranmer investigated. Catherine panicked and confessed to her previous relationships, but denied the affair with Culpeper, and then everyone else involved started talking to save their own skins. The investigation revealed not just Catherine's past, but also the ongoing affair with Culpeper. Letters between them were discovered. Lady Rochford confessed to facilitating their meetings. The whole sordid story came tumbling out, and Henry, who thought he'd finally found his perfect young bride, was absolutely devastated. According to reports, he actually cried when he was told, which is one of the few times we see genuine emotion from Henry, rather than just rage or self-pity. But devastation quickly turned to fury. Catherine Howard was arrested, questioned, and held in house arrest while the evidence piled up. Culpeper and Dereham were tried, found guilty, and executed. Culpeper was beheaded because he was a gentleman, while Dereham was hanged, drawn, and quartered because he wasn't, which tells you everything about Tudor concepts of justice and class privilege. Lady Rochford also went to the Tower, and she apparently suffered some kind of mental breakdown while imprisoned, which didn't save her from execution. Catherine herself was attainted by an Act of Parliament rather than being given a trial, probably because Henry couldn't face another courtroom drama like Anne Boleyn's trial. She was beheaded on February 13, 1542, on the same scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died. She was probably only about 20 years old. Legend has it that she practiced laying her head on the block the night before her execution, wanting to die with dignity, which is almost unbearably sad when you think about how young she was and how little control she'd had over any aspect of her life. So let's take a step back and look at what all these stories tell us about the Tudor court and the absolutely bonkers way that love, sex, and power intersected there. First, and most obviously, being the object of Henry VIII's affection was genuinely one of the most dangerous positions a woman could occupy in 16th century England. Out of his 6 wives, 2 were beheaded, 2 were divorced, 1 died in childbirth, and only one, Catherine Parr, his last wife, managed to outlive him, probably because she was smart enough and lucky enough to survive until Henry died of his own health problems. But beyond just Henry's personal body count, these stories show us how the Tudor court turned romantic relationships into political weapons. Anne Boleyn didn't just seduce the king for fun, she used her sexuality and her intelligence to position herself for power, and in doing so she triggered a religious revolution. The break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the establishment of the Church of England. All of that stemmed from Henry's desire to marry Anne. One woman's calculated risk-taking literally changed the course of English history. Mary Boleyn represents the other side of that coin. What happened when you gave in to the king without demanding guarantees? She got used and discarded, and while she at least kept her head, she ended up with nothing to show for her time as royal mistress except a scandalous reputation. Her story probably served as a cautionary tale for other women at court, though clearly not cautionary enough given that people kept making the same mistakes. Catherine Howard's story is perhaps the most tragic because she was so young and had so little agency. She was essentially groomed by her family to be placed in front of the king, married off to a man old enough to be her grandfather, and then found guilty of treason for behaviours that had started when she was barely more than a child. Her execution wasn't about justice, it was about Henry's wounded pride and his fury at being made to look foolish by a teenager. But here's what's really fascinating about the Tudor approach to romantic relationships. The double standard was so extreme it became almost absurd. Henry VIII had numerous mistresses throughout all his marriages. He fathered at least 1 illegitimate child that we know of, probably more. He pursued married women, including Mary Boleyn while she was married to William Carey. He broke up his court by constantly chasing after ladies-in-waiting and making them choose between their loyalty to their mistresses and their fear of rejecting the king. But all of that was perfectly acceptable because he was the king and also a man. Meanwhile, his wives were expected to be absolutely faithful, to produce male heirs on demand, to accept his infidelities without complaint, and to essentially be perfect at all times, while also being interesting enough to keep his attention, which was impossible because nothing kept Henry's attention for long. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on charges of adultery that were almost certainly false. Catherine Howard was beheaded for actions that took place before her marriage, and for an affair that paled in comparison to Henry's own behaviour. The message was clear. Women at the Tudor court existed to serve the king's needs and desires, and stepping outside those bounds, even slightly, could be fatal. The Boleyn family's story is particularly instructive because it shows how families used their daughters as pawns in this dangerous game. Thomas Boleyn, father of Mary and Anne, definitely profited from both daughters' relationships with the king. He received numerous offices, titles and grants during their time in royal favour. When Anne was queen, he was one of the most powerful men in England. He clearly had no problem with pimping out his daughters for political advancement, which was unfortunately pretty standard behaviour for ambitious Tudor nobles. But the Boleyn strategy was also incredibly high risk. When Anne fell, the entire Boleyn faction was destroyed. Thomas Boleyn lost all his offices and died in disgrace a few years later. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was executed alongside her on completely fabricated charges of incest. Mary Boleyn, who'd had the sense to marry for love after her time as royal mistress, ended up impoverished when her family's fortunes collapsed. Playing the Tudor romance game could elevate your entire family to unimaginable heights, but the fall was just as dramatic. The same pattern repeated with the Howard family and Catherine Howard. The Howards had regained influence through Catherine's marriage to Henry, but when she was executed, the family was nearly destroyed. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, had to prostrate himself before the king and beg forgiveness for his niece's actions, essentially throwing his entire family under the bus to save his own skin. He succeeded, barely, but the Howards never fully recovered the power they'd held before Catherine's disgrace. This is what made the Tudor court such a unique and terrifying place. In most royal courts, romantic intrigue was common, but it rarely had such dramatic and permanent consequences. Kings had mistresses, queens occasionally had lovers, and while there might be scandal and drama, people generally weren't executed left and right for bedroom behaviour. But Henry VIII managed to weaponize romance in a way that turned every relationship into a potential death sentence. Part of this was Henry's own psychological makeup. He had a narcissistic inability to see himself as the problem in any situation. When his marriages failed, it was always the woman's fault. She was too old, too ugly, too German, too promiscuous, too unable to produce sons. The idea that maybe he was the common denominator in all these failed relationships never seemed to occur to him, or if it did, he couldn't accept it. Each new marriage was going to be different because this woman was different. This woman was special. This woman would finally make him happy. And then when she inevitably failed to live up to his impossible expectations, she had to be destroyed rather than simply divorced, because Henry needed everyone to agree that the failure was her fault, not his. This psychology turned Henry's romantic relationships into a kind of escalating violence. Catherine of Aragon was divorced and exiled, which was harsh but at least left her alive. Anne Boleyn was executed in a calculated political move. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, which wasn't Henry's fault but also didn't exactly inspire him to reconsider his approach to marriage. Anne of Cleves was smart enough to accept an annulment without protest, and lived comfortably for the rest of her life, making her possibly the only one of Henry's wives who actually won the game. Catherine Howard was executed with even less ceremony than Anne Boleyn, as if Henry had gotten efficient at disposing of wives who disappointed him. And Catherine Parr survived primarily because she was clever enough to defer to Henry on everything, especially religion, and because Henry died before he could turn on her the way he'd turned on previous wives. The women who survived in this environment were the ones who understood the rules and played accordingly. Catherine Parr succeeded by being a nurse and companion rather than a passionate love interest. Anne of Cleves succeeded by accepting defeat gracefully and not making herself a problem. Mary Boleyn succeeded by getting out of the game early and staying out. Jane Seymour would probably have succeeded long-term if she hadn't died in childbirth, because she'd figured out that meekness and obedience were the keys to managing Henry. But the ones who tried to be partners to Henry, who thought they could use their intelligence or sexuality or personality to carve out real power for themselves, those were the ones who ended up on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn thought she could be Henry's intellectual equal and his political partner. Catherine Howard thought, in her naive teenage way, that she could have some kind of romantic life of her own. Both were catastrophically wrong, because Henry didn't want partners. He wanted accessories that could produce sons and reflect glory on him, and when they failed at either task, they became disposable. This is what made the Tudor revolution of love so significant. It wasn't really about love at all. It was about power, succession, and one man's absolute inability to take responsibility for his own failures. Henry VIII managed to convince himself, and convince England, that his romantic desires were matters of national importance. His need to marry Anne Boleyn became a religious revolution. His disappointment with Anne Boleyn became a political purge. His infatuation with Catherine Howard became a national scandal. Every personal feeling he had got magnified and inflicted on the entire country, with body counts to match. And the crazy thing is, it worked. Henry got away with all of it. He was never held accountable for the lives he destroyed, the families he ruined, or the chaos he caused. When he died in 1547, he was still king, still convinced of his own righteousness, still certain that all his marriages had failed because of the women and not because of him. He left behind 3 children from 3 different mothers, Edward from Jane Seymour, Mary from Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth from Anne Boleyn, and managed to exclude both daughters from the succession in favour of his son, at least initially, because even in death he couldn't acknowledge that maybe the daughters he'd declared illegitimate were just as capable of ruling as the sickly boy who would die at 15. The irony, of course, is that Elizabeth I, the daughter of the woman Henry killed for failing to produce a son, would become the greatest Tudor monarch of all. She would rule for 45 years, defeat the Spanish Armada, preside over a golden age of English culture, and die peacefully in her bed, having never married and never produced an heir. She learned from her father's mistakes and her mother's fate that marriage and love were luxuries a female ruler couldn't afford. She weaponized her unmarried status the way her mother had tried to weaponize her refusal to become a mistress. But Elizabeth had power her mother never had, and she used it to keep herself safe while keeping potential suitors dangling for decades. So when we talk about the Tudor revolution of love, we're really talking about how one man's romantic dysfunction reshaped an entire nation. We're talking about how women's bodies became battlegrounds for political conflict. We're talking about how the personal became political in the most literal and deadly way possible. And we're talking about how a court culture developed where love was never just love. It was always also strategy, danger, opportunity, and quite possibly a death sentence. The women who navigated this world, Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and all the others who appear in the margins of these stories, weren't stupid or naive, despite what simplified histories might suggest. They were playing a game where the rules were rigged against them from the start, where the only way to win was to be useful to the king without being threatening, interesting without being too interesting, fertile without having the wrong kind of children, and lucky enough to die or be divorced before Henry decided he needed a more permanent solution to his marital dissatisfaction. Some of them made miscalculations. Anne Boleyn probably should have been less willing to speak her mind and less confident in her ability to maintain Henry's interest. Catherine Howard should have understood that her past would eventually catch up with her and that an affair with Culpeper was signing her own death warrant. But they were working with limited information and even more limited options in a world that gave them almost no control over their own lives. And that's really the heart of the Tudor revolution of love. It wasn't a revolution that empowered anyone except Henry VIII. It was a revolution that showed just how far a monarch could go in subordinating everything – religion, politics, other people's lives – to his own personal desires. It established a pattern where royal romance wasn't a private matter, but a public spectacle with potentially fatal consequences. And it created a template that would echo through English royal history for centuries to come, where the personal lives of royals would be dissected, politicised, and turned into weapons by everyone with an agenda. The Tudor court was essentially a laboratory for the most toxic version of royal romance possible, and Henry VIII was the mad scientist running the experiments. The fact that he's remembered as one of England's most significant kings rather than as a serial wife killer says everything about how history gets written by the powerful. The women he destroyed get footnotes or villain roles or tragic heroine treatment depending on who's writing the history. But Henry gets to be important, significant, a man who changed the course of nations. But standing here centuries later, with the benefit of hindsight and modern psychology, and a basic understanding that maybe beheading your wives is not normal behaviour, we can see the Tudor revolution of love for what it really was. A cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power meets absolute entitlement and an inability to take responsibility for anything. The grand romantic gestures, the love letters, the religious reformation, it was all just window dressing on a fundamentally abusive dynamic, where one person had all the power and everyone else was just trying not to end up on the scaffold. The Boleyn sisters, Catherine Howard, and all the other women caught up in Henry's romantic chaos deserved better than they got. They deserved to live in an era where their worth wasn't measured by their ability to please a king or produce male heirs. They deserved to have some control over their own bodies and their own lives. They deserved not to be executed for the crime of disappointing a man who was himself deeply disappointing in almost every way that mattered. But they didn't get what they deserved. They got the Tudor court instead, where love was a weapon, marriage was a political arrangement, and disappointing the king could cost you your head. And that, in all its brutal and tragic reality, is what the Tudor revolution of love actually looked like behind all the romance and drama and historical glossing. It was dangerous, it was deadly, and for the women involved it was almost never worth the risk. Yet they took the risks anyway, because what choice did they have? When the king wanted you, you couldn't exactly say no and expect to live a quiet life. When your family pushed you forward, you couldn't refuse without destroying your entire family's prospects. When opportunity presented itself at court, you had to grab it, because opportunities for women were few and far between, and passing one up might mean never getting another chance. So they played the game, these Tudor women, with skill and courage and sometimes with fatal miscalculation. They tried to navigate an impossible system and find some measure of power, security or happiness in a world designed to give them none of those things. Some survived, most didn't, and all of them paid a price for having the misfortune of being beautiful, interesting, or useful enough to attract the attention of Henry VIII. That's the real story of the Tudor revolution of love. Not a romance, not an adventure, but a tragedy played out over decades with real human costs that we're still counting centuries later. And it's just the beginning of our journey through royal romantic disasters, because Henry VIII might have been uniquely lethal, but he certainly wasn't the only monarch who turned love into a weapon, or who destroyed lives in pursuit of personal happiness. He just did it with more flair and more permanent consequences than most. The Tudor court set the standard for dangerous royal romance, and that standard would echo through British royal history for centuries to come. Every scandal, every forbidden love, every romantic disaster that followed had the shadow of the Tudors hanging over it. A reminder that when you're royal, love is never just love. It's always politics, it's always dangerous, and it's always being watched by people who would be happy to see you fall. Now, if Henry VIII represented the absolute worst-case scenario of royal romance, where love led directly to religious revolution and beheadings, his daughter Elizabeth represents something entirely different, and arguably far more interesting. She took everything she'd learned from watching her father destroy lives in pursuit of marital happiness and decided to try a completely different approach. What if she just never got married at all, but kept everyone thinking she might? This was a radical strategy for a 16th century queen, and it shouldn't have worked. By all the logic of the era, Elizabeth needed to marry. She needed to produce heirs. She needed a husband to help her rule, because everyone knew women couldn't possibly govern alone, or at least that's what everyone kept telling her, loudly and repeatedly, for basically her entire 45-year reign. But Elizabeth looked at her father's 6 marriages, her sister Mary's disastrous union with Philip II of Spain, and the general carnage that seemed to follow Tudor marriages like a persistent plague, and decided that maybe the single life wasn't such a bad option after all. Of course, she couldn't just announce "I'm never getting married, deal with it" on day 1 of her reign. That would have caused immediate panic, probably a few coup attempts, and definitely a lot of very concerned letters from foreign ambassadors. So instead, Elizabeth developed what might be the most sophisticated political dating strategy in history. She would flirt with everyone, promise marriage to no one, and use the possibility of her hand in marriage as a diplomatic tool to be dangled, withdrawn, and dangled again as circumstances required. And it worked. Somehow, against all odds and all conventional wisdom, it actually worked. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, died peacefully in her bed, and never had to deal with a husband trying to take over her kingdom, or having her executed when she failed to produce a male heir. She turned her unmarried status from a weakness into a strength, and in the process she kept a parade of male favourites dancing on strings for decades. It was manipulation on a grand scale, and it was absolutely magnificent to watch. But here's the thing about Elizabeth's strategy. It wasn't just political calculation. She did have genuine feelings for some of these men, particularly Robert Dudley, and those feelings complicated everything. She had to balance her personal desires against her political needs, her emotional attachments against her determination to never give anyone power over her. And she had to do all of this while managing the egos of men who thought they deserved to be king just because she'd smiled at them across a crowded room. Let's start with Robert Dudley, because if Elizabeth ever came close to actually marrying someone, it was him. They'd known each other since childhood. Both had been imprisoned in the Tower of London during Mary Lorraine's reign, though at different times and for different reasons. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, she immediately made Dudley her Master of Horse, which sounds like a position involving actual horses, but was really about giving him constant access to her presence and making him one of the most powerful men at court. The chemistry between them was immediate and obvious and absolutely scandalous. Elizabeth was 25, newly crowned and supposedly considering various marriage proposals from eligible princes across Europe. Robert Dudley was also 25, undeniably handsome, great at sports and dancing and all the things that impressed a Renaissance court, and unfortunately extremely married. His wife was Amy Robsart, and she was very much alive, which put a significant damper on any potential royal romance. But that didn't stop Elizabeth and Dudley from behaving like besotted teenagers. They spent hours together every day. They danced together. They went riding together. She gave him apartments at court right next to hers, which raised eyebrows so high they practically achieved orbit. Foreign ambassadors sent shocked reports back to their governments about the Queen's scandalous behaviour with this married man. One Spanish ambassador wrote that Elizabeth visited Dudley in his chamber both day and night, which might have been diplomatic exaggeration, but was definitely the kind of rumour that made people panic about the Queen's virtue and the succession, and whether England was about to implode into chaos again. The English court watched this developing situation with increasing alarm. If Elizabeth married Dudley, it would be a disaster. He was English nobility but not royal, and his family had a sketchy political history. His father and grandfather had both been executed for treason in previous reigns, which was not exactly the kind of family background that screamed stable choice for king consort. Plus, the married thing. That was kind of a significant obstacle. And then, in September 1560, Amy Robsart died. She was found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, and immediately everyone assumed murder. The rumours spread like wildfire. Dudley had killed his wife so he could marry the Queen, or Elizabeth had ordered the killing, or they'd both conspired together. It didn't matter that there was no evidence of murder. It didn't matter that Amy might have fallen accidentally or even committed suicide. She was apparently suffering from a malady in one of her breasts, which was probably breast cancer, and might have made her suicidal. None of that mattered because the court of public opinion had already decided this was murder, and Elizabeth and Dudley were the obvious suspects. The scandal should have ended any possibility of marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley. And in a way, it did. Elizabeth was far too politically savvy to marry a man everyone believed had murdered his wife, even if she desperately wanted to. But it didn't end their relationship. If anything, it intensified it, because now they were bound together by tragedy and scandal and the impossible situation they'd created. For years after Amy's death, the marriage question hung in the air. Would she? Wouldn't she? Foreign ambassadors reported that she definitely would. Her advisors begged her not to. Dudley himself seems to have genuinely believed at various points that she would eventually agree to marry him. She gave him increasingly prestigious titles and positions, made him Earl of Leicester, gave him lands and money and power. She wore his miniature portrait. She called him her eyes in private letters, which is either adorable or vaguely creepy depending on your perspective. But she never actually agreed to marry him. Every time it looked like she might, she'd pull back. She'd raise objections. She'd say she was still considering other options. She'd change the subject. It was like watching someone dangle a carrot in front of a horse for 20 years, except the horse was a powerful nobleman who increasingly realised he was never going to actually get the carrot. Here's what makes Elizabeth's relationship with Dudley so fascinating from a political perspective. She managed to keep him completely devoted to her, without ever actually committing to anything. He never married anyone else for years, not until 1578, when he was 45 years old and had finally accepted that Elizabeth was never going to marry him. And even then, when he secretly married Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth was absolutely furious. She banished Lettice from court and was barely civil to Dudley for months. The message was clear. She might not marry him herself, but she also wasn't going to tolerate him marrying anyone else without suffering consequences. This was the pattern that would define Elizabeth's relationships with her favourites. She would draw them close, make them believe they were special, give them access and influence that other men could only dream of, and then pull back the moment they seemed to be getting too powerful or too presumptuous. It was a delicate balancing act that required incredible emotional intelligence and political skill, and also a certain ruthlessness when it came to using people's feelings for her own ends. But was it all political calculation? Did Elizabeth actually have feelings for Dudley, or was she just using him? The truth is probably somewhere in between, which is what makes it interesting. The letters between them that survive show genuine affection and intimacy. She kept his last letter to her beside her bed until she died, which suggests some real emotional attachment. But she also never let those feelings push her into a marriage that would have been politically disastrous and would have given Dudley power over her. Elizabeth had watched her father turn into a monster when he had absolute power. She'd watched her sister Mary become a puppet to her husband, Philip II of Spain. She knew, better than almost anyone in history, what marriage could do to a female monarch's independence and authority. So she chose to keep her power and sacrifice the possibility of a conventional married life. And she managed to do it while maintaining close emotional connections with men who made her feel desired and valued and loved, even if she couldn't or wouldn't marry them. Dudley remained close to Elizabeth until his death in 1588, right after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. He died at age 55, probably of stomach cancer, and Elizabeth was devastated. She locked herself in her room and had to be forced out by her advisors. She kept his last letter in a box beside her bed marked "His Last Letter" in her own handwriting, and it was found there when she died 15 years later. Whatever else their relationship was, political alliance, emotional manipulation, friendship, love, it clearly mattered deeply to her. But Elizabeth couldn't afford to mourn for long because she'd already moved on to her next favourite, and this one would turn out to be far more dangerous than Dudley ever was. Enter Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, who was everything that could go wrong with Elizabeth's favourite collecting strategy, wrapped up in one ambitious, charming, absolutely infuriating package. Essex was Dudley's stepson. His mother Lettice Knollys had married Dudley after her first husband died, which had caused that whole drama with Elizabeth banishing her from court. Essex himself was 33 years younger than Elizabeth, which should have made him an unlikely candidate for royal favourite. When he first came to court in the 1580s, she was in her 50s and he was barely 20. But Elizabeth had never been one to let age differences get in the way of a good flirtation, and Essex was undeniably attractive, charismatic, well-educated, and desperate to prove himself as a military hero. He was also spoiled, impulsive, arrogant, and had an absolute gift for making catastrophically bad decisions while being completely convinced he was right. If Dudley had been Elizabeth's safe emotional harbour, someone who genuinely cared for her and understood the game they were playing, Essex was the equivalent of a romantic disaster waiting to happen. And Elizabeth, despite being one of the smartest monarchs in English history, couldn't seem to help herself. The relationship developed quickly. Essex became a fixture at court, attending on Elizabeth constantly. She gave him gifts, offices, and money. She tolerated his temper tantrums when he didn't get his way, which was often, because Essex wanted military commands and foreign adventures, and kept getting disappointed when Elizabeth refused to risk English resources on his half-baked schemes. He was essentially a 20-something who thought he knew better than the Queen who'd successfully ruled England for 25 years, which was as obnoxious as it sounds. But here's where it gets complicated, because Essex wasn't just some random ambitious courtier. He was genuinely talented in some ways, a gifted poet, a charismatic leader, popular with the common people and with sections of the nobility. He also represented a younger generation at court that was getting impatient with Elizabeth's cautious policies. She'd kept England at peace for decades through careful diplomacy and avoiding expensive foreign wars, which was great for the economy, but not so great for young nobles who wanted to win glory on the battlefield. Essex became the focal point for this faction. He pushed for aggressive action against Spain. He wanted military intervention in France and the Netherlands. He lobbied for his friends to receive positions and offices, and he threw spectacular fits when Elizabeth denied him. And somehow, despite all of this, or maybe because of it, Elizabeth was absolutely besotted with him in a way that she'd never quite been with anyone else, including Dudley. The age difference made the whole thing slightly uncomfortable to watch, frankly. She was old enough to be his grandmother. She wore wigs and heavy makeup to hide her aging appearance, while Essex was in his physical prime. Foreign ambassadors wrote about the situation with barely concealed bewilderment. Here was this aging queen, supposedly virgin and unmarried by choice, obviously infatuated with a man young enough to be her grandson. It didn't fit the image of the dignified, powerful monarch who'd held England together for decades. But Elizabeth didn't seem to care what anyone thought about the age gap. She called Essex her wild horse, and tolerated behaviour from him that she would never have accepted from anyone else. When he secretly married Frances Walsingham, the widow of Sir Philip Sidney, Elizabeth was angry but forgave him fairly quickly, unlike her years-long fury at Dudley's marriage. When Essex failed spectacularly at military commands she'd given him, she made excuses for him and gave him more chances. The relationship was passionate in a way Elizabeth's other favourites hadn't been. They had legendary arguments that the entire court could hear. Once, during a council meeting in 1598, they got into such a heated disagreement about military appointments in Ireland that Essex actually turned his back on the Queen, which was an unbelievable breach of protocol. Elizabeth slapped him. Essex put his hand on his sword. For a moment it looked like he might actually draw it, which would have been treason. Instead, he stormed out, and later wrote her a long letter complaining about the slap and defending his behaviour, because apparently he thought the problem was that she'd hit him, and not that he'd shown gross disrespect to his monarch. And Elizabeth forgave him. Again. This became the pattern. Essex would do something outrageous. They'd have a massive fight. He'd storm off in a fury, and then she'd eventually take him back because she couldn't seem to help herself. It was like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove while insisting that this time it would be different. The situation came to a head with Ireland. In 1599, Elizabeth finally gave Essex what he'd been demanding for years, command of a major military expedition. She made him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and sent him with an army to put down a rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. It was Essex's big chance to prove himself as the military genius he claimed to be. He failed. Spectacularly. Instead of engaging Tyrone in battle, Essex marched around Ireland achieving nothing, knighted too many of his followers without permission, and then negotiated an unauthorised truce with Tyrone that was basically a surrender with better PR. He'd wasted enormous amounts of money, gotten nothing done, and directly disobeyed Elizabeth's orders about how to conduct the campaign. When Elizabeth recalled him to court to explain himself, Essex made possibly the worst decision of his life. Instead of coming back prepared to defend his actions, he left Ireland without permission. rode to London with a small group of followers, burst into Elizabeth's bedchamber at dawn while she was still in her nightgown with her hair down and her face unmade, and tried to explain himself in private before she could hear other accounts of his failures. Let's pause here to appreciate how catastrophically stupid this was. Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen, as Gloriana, as this semi-divine figure, was carefully constructed and maintained. She never appeared in public without elaborate makeup, wigs, and costumes designed to project power and majesty. Her private appearance was a closely guarded secret, and allowing anyone to see her unprepared was giving them dangerous leverage. By bursting in on her like this, Essex had essentially assaulted her privacy and her carefully constructed public persona. Elizabeth initially seemed calm about it. She spoke with him. She let him explain. But as the day wore on and she had time to think about what he'd done, the presumption of it, the violation of it, her fury grew. Essex was placed under house arrest. He was questioned by the Privy Council about his conduct in Ireland. He was stripped of most of his offices and income. The man who'd been the Queen's favourite, who'd had access to her whenever he wanted it, was suddenly shut out completely. For Essex, this was intolerable. He'd spent years believing he was special, that Elizabeth loved him, that he could get away with anything because of their relationship. Now he was broke, disgraced, and shut out from the woman he had assumed would always forgive him. And instead of accepting responsibility for his failures and working to rebuild his reputation, he decided the problem was everyone else. In February 1601, Essex attempted a coup. It was possibly the most poorly planned rebellion in English history, which is saying something. The idea was that he'd lead his followers through London, rally popular support, seize control of the court, and force Elizabeth to dismiss his enemies and restore him to favour. What actually happened was that he and about 300 supporters marched through London, while confused citizens mostly stayed inside, failed to gain any meaningful support, and ended up trapped by royal forces. The whole thing was over in a day. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and found guilty. His trial featured all his letters to Elizabeth being read aloud in court, which must have been humiliating for everyone involved. He was executed on February 25, 1601, at the Tower of London. He was 34 years old. Elizabeth signed the death warrant and never wavered in her decision, even though multiple sources say she was devastated by the necessity of it. And here's what's so tragic about the whole Essex situation. It never had to end this way. If Essex had just accepted that he wasn't going to be the exception to every rule, if he'd managed his ambitions with even a fraction of the political skill Elizabeth demonstrated daily, he could have lived a long life as a respected, if not always successful, courtier. But he convinced himself that Elizabeth's affection for him meant he could do anything, and when he realised that wasn't true, he couldn't handle it. The contrast between Dudley and Essex is instructive. Dudley understood the game. He knew Elizabeth would never actually marry him, but he accepted the role of favourite because being close to her was better than not being close to her. He worked within the system, supported her policies even when he disagreed with them, and remained loyal until his death. Essex, on the other hand, thought the rules didn't apply to him. He believed his own mythology. He confused Elizabeth's affection with political invincibility, and when reality hit, he chose rebellion over acceptance. But what does all of this tell us about Elizabeth and her use of flirtation as a political tool? First, it shows that she was incredibly skilled at managing powerful men's egos while never actually giving them real power over her. She could make them feel special and valued without ever making commitments that would compromise her authority. This was no small achievement in an era when everyone assumed women needed men to help them rule. Second, it demonstrates that Elizabeth's strategy came with real emotional costs. She clearly had genuine feelings for both Dudley and Essex, and those feelings complicated her political decision-making. With Dudley, the complication was relatively benign. She wanted to marry him but couldn't, so they settled for a close friendship that lasted decades. With Essex, the emotional involvement nearly became dangerous, because he exploited her affection to get away with increasingly outrageous behaviour until he finally went too far. Third, Elizabeth's approach to favourites shows how she weaponised the marriage question. By keeping everyone guessing about whether she'd marry, whom she'd marry, and when she'd marry, she maintained leverage in diplomatic negotiations and kept domestic factions off balance. Foreign princes and kings had to take her seriously as a potential bride, which gave her negotiating power. Domestic nobles had to accept that she might marry one of them, which kept them competing for her favour. And through it all, Elizabeth kept control because she was the only one who knew she was never actually going to marry anyone. The Virgin Queen persona was brilliant political branding. It positioned Elizabeth as married to England, devoted solely to her kingdom and her people. It allowed her to maintain an image of purity and divine favour, while still enjoying close relationships with attractive men. It gave her freedom that married queens never had, and it protected her from the fate of her mother and Catherine Howard, beheaded for real or imagined infidelity. But the persona also required constant maintenance. Elizabeth had to be careful never to let any relationship develop to the point where marriage became expected, or where her virtue could be seriously questioned. She had to balance closeness with distance, affection with authority, personal desire with political necessity. And she had to do all of this while everyone from foreign ambassadors to her own advisors was constantly watching, judging, and reporting on her every interaction with men. The genius of Elizabeth's approach is that she turned what everyone saw as her greatest weakness, being an unmarried woman, into her greatest strength. By refusing to marry, she avoided giving any man power over her kingdom. By flirting and keeping the possibility of marriage alive, she kept men devoted to her and useful to her purposes. By cultivating emotional relationships without physical consummation, at least as far as anyone could prove, she maintained her image as the Virgin Queen while still enjoying intimacy and companionship. This strategy shouldn't have worked for 45 years. By all the logic of 16th century politics, Elizabeth should have been forced to marry early in her reign, or she should have been overthrown by nobles who couldn't accept female rule. But she managed to convince enough people enough of the time that she knew what she was doing, that her unmarried state was a choice rather than a failure, and that England was better off with her as Virgin Queen than with her married to anyone. The cost of this strategy was personal. Elizabeth never had children, never had a conventional family life, never got to experience the kind of partnership that marriage could provide at its best. She had favourites and companions and people she genuinely cared about, but those relationships always had to be subordinated to her role as queen. When Essex threatened her authority, she had him executed despite her feelings for him. When Dudley wanted to marry her, she had to refuse despite her attachment to him. The crown came first, always, and everyone else's needs and desires, including her own, had to come second. But was it worth it? From Elizabeth's perspective, probably yes. She ruled successfully for 45 years, kept England relatively peaceful and prosperous, defeated the Spanish Armada, and presided over a golden age of English culture. She died peacefully in her bed at age 69, having never been forced to share power with a husband, or having been executed for failing to produce male heirs like her mother and cousin Catherine Howard. From the perspective of people like Dudley and Essex, the answer is more complicated. Dudley seems to have accepted his role and found satisfaction in being close to Elizabeth, even if he couldn't marry her. Essex destroyed himself trying to force Elizabeth to give him what he wanted, convinced that he deserved special treatment because of their relationship. The difference between them shows what happened when you understood the game Elizabeth was playing, versus when you convinced yourself the rules didn't apply to you. Elizabeth's relationships with her favourites also reveal something important about how she understood power. She knew that emotional connections could be just as powerful as political alliances, maybe more so. By making powerful men emotionally dependent on her approval and her affection, she bound them to her in ways that legal contracts or political agreements couldn't match. Dudley stayed loyal because he loved her, and because being her favourite gave his life meaning. Essex rebelled because he couldn't handle losing that special status, which shows that even his attempted coup was, in a twisted way, about his emotional investment in their relationship. This emotional manipulation, because let's call it what it was, required Elizabeth to be constantly alert to the psychological dynamics at play. She had to know when to draw someone closer and when to push them away. She had to understand what motivated each favourite and how to keep them useful without letting them become dangerous. She had to balance multiple relationships simultaneously, managing jealousies and competitions while making each person feel special. It was emotionally exhausting work, and it never stopped for her entire reign. The other thing Elizabeth's favourites reveal is how she used them to compensate for the limitations of her position as a female monarch. In theory, queens weren't supposed to lead armies or engage in rough physical activities, or participate in certain aspects of political life that were considered masculine domains. But Elizabeth could send her favourites to do those things on her behalf. Dudley led military campaigns. Essex fought in various conflicts. They became extensions of her will, allowing her to project power in ways that would have been harder for her to do directly. But this delegation came with risks, as Essex demonstrated. When your favourites start to see themselves as indispensable, when they begin to confuse being your representative with being your equal, they become dangerous. Elizabeth managed this risk successfully with most of her favourites, but Essex showed what could happen when someone refused to understand the boundaries. The relationship between Elizabeth and her favourites also highlights the performance aspect of Tudor court life. Everything was theatre. Elizabeth's virginity, her relationships with favourites, the way she granted or withheld favour, all of it was carefully staged to project specific messages about her power and her kingdom. The favourites were actors in this theatre, playing roles that Elizabeth assigned them. When they stayed in character, like Dudley did, everything worked beautifully. When they broke character and tried to write their own scripts, like Essex did, the whole production fell apart. What's remarkable is how long Elizabeth maintained this elaborate performance. For 45 years she managed her favourites, balanced competing interests, used flirtation and the promise of marriage to achieve political goals, and never once actually gave anyone real power over her. She did this while aging, which meant fighting increasingly harder to maintain the glamorous image that the Virgin Queen persona required. She did this while dealing with plots against her life, threats from foreign powers, religious conflicts, economic problems, and all the other challenges of ruling a Renaissance kingdom. And she did it alone, because she'd decided that being alone was safer than giving anyone the power to hurt her, the way her father had hurt so many women. In the end, Elizabeth's relationships with her favourites, especially with Dudley and Essex, show us a woman who understood that in her world, love and power were inextricably linked, and power always had to come first. She could have feelings for people, could be emotionally vulnerable in private, could write affectionate letters and keep sentimental tokens. But when it came down to a choice between her feelings and her authority, her personal happiness and England's welfare, she chose duty every single time. This made her a great queen. It also made her in many ways a lonely one. The favourites provided companionship and emotional support, but there was always a barrier between Elizabeth and them, because she was the queen and they were not, and that fundamental inequality could never be overcome. She could lower the barrier temporarily, as she did with Dudley in their quiet moments together, or with Essex when they were getting along well. But it was always there, and when she needed to, she could raise it instantly and remind everyone that she was the monarch and they served at her pleasure. The Virgin Queen image has dominated how we think about Elizabeth Anne for centuries, but looking at her relationships with her favourites, especially Dudley and Essex, shows us that virginity might not have been the most important part of the equation. What mattered was control. Control over her own body, her own choices, her own kingdom. Control over the men who wanted to marry her, sleep with her, influence her, or rule through her. Control over the narrative of who she was and what her reign meant. Elizabeth achieved that control by never quite committing to anyone or anything except England itself. She flirted but didn't marry. She had favourites but never gave them permanent power. She inspired devotion but never became dependent on anyone. And when someone like Essex threatened that control, she eliminated the threat no matter what it cost her emotionally. This is what made Elizabeth's approach to favourites so revolutionary. Previous queens had relied on their husbands or had become victims of powerful favourites who manipulated them. But Elizabeth turned the favourite system into a tool of governance, using emotional connections to bind powerful men to her service, while never allowing those connections to compromise her authority. It was cold, it was calculating, and it worked brilliantly for more than 4 decades. The tragedy is that this success came at a personal price. Elizabeth never got to experience the kind of uncomplicated love and partnership that wasn't about power dynamics and political calculation. Her relationships with Dudley and Essex, however genuine the feelings involved, were always shaped by the fact that she was queen and they were subjects. There was no equality, no possibility of real vulnerability, no way to separate the personal from the political. But maybe that's exactly what Elizabeth wanted. Maybe after watching her father's marriages destroy so many lives, and after seeing how her sister Mary's marriage to Philip II diminished Mary's authority, Elizabeth decided that the personal cost of staying single was worth it for the political benefits it provided. Maybe she genuinely preferred power and independence to love and family. Or maybe she just decided that in her world, in her position, she couldn't have both, and between the two she chose what would keep her alive and keep England stable. Either way, Elizabeth's relationships with her favourites, the way she drew them close without ever quite letting them in, the way she inspired devotion without ever becoming dependent, the way she weaponized flirtation and the promise of marriage to achieve political ends, represent one of the most sophisticated uses of emotional manipulation in political history. She turned what everyone saw as weakness into strength, turned disadvantage into advantage, and kept some of the most ambitious and powerful men in England dancing on strings for decades. And she did it all while maintaining the fiction that she was the Virgin Queen, married to England, devoted solely to her people's welfare. It was a performance for the ages, and the fact that it worked for 45 years says everything about Elizabeth's intelligence, political skill, and absolute refusal to let anyone else control her destiny. Her father had used his wives and destroyed them when they failed to serve his purposes. Elizabeth used her favourites and kept them devoted without ever giving them the power to hurt her. It was the ultimate reversal of the Tudor pattern, and it's one of the many reasons why Elizabeth is remembered as one of the greatest monarchs in English history, while Henry VIII is remembered as, well, the guy who had 6 wives and beheaded 2 of them. The Virgin Queen might never have married, but she understood romance and power better than almost any monarch before or since. And that understanding, applied with ruthless consistency over 45 years, is what made her so successful and so impossible to manipulate. Her favourites thought they were special, thought they might be the one she'd marry, thought their relationship gave them power. But in the end, the only person who ever really had power in those relationships was Elizabeth herself, and she made sure it stayed that way until the day she died. If Elizabeth represents the triumph of political calculation over romantic feeling, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, represents the absolute opposite. What happens when you let passion drive your decision-making in a world where every choice has deadly political consequences? Mary's story is basically a masterclass in how not to be a monarch, and at the centre of her catastrophic reign was her relationship with James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man who makes Essex look like a responsible adult by comparison. But before we get to Bothwell and the spectacular implosion of Mary's reign, we need to understand how she ended up in a position where falling for the wrong guy could destroy everything. Because Mary's romantic disasters didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened against the backdrop of Scottish politics, which made Tudor court intrigue look like a pleasant garden party by comparison. Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old, which is the kind of start in life that doesn't exactly set you up for stable adulthood. Her father, James V, died shortly after hearing about the birth of his daughter, and the devastating Scottish defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss. According to legend, his last words were about how the Scottish crown had come to his family through a woman, and would leave through one, which was both dramatic and unnecessarily pessimistic. But this was the 16th century, and people were really into prophetic deathbed statements. Infant Mary was immediately caught up in political schemes about who she'd marry, because marrying off royal children was basically the Renaissance equivalent of signing international treaties, except with more chance of producing heirs and starting wars. Henry VIII wanted her to marry his son Edward, which would have unified the Scottish and English crowns. The Scottish nobility said absolutely not, we're not trusting our queen to the English, and sent Mary to France instead when she was 5 years old to be raised at the French court and eventually marry the French Dauphin. So Mary grew up in France, at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, speaking French as her first language, learning to be charming and cultured and basically everything a Renaissance princess should be. She married Francis, the Dauphin, when she was 15, and became Queen of France when he succeeded to the throne in 1559. For a brief moment, Mary was Queen of Scotland and Queen of France, which was an impressive resume for a 17-year-old. Then Francis died in 1560 after reigning for barely a year, probably from an ear infection that turned into a brain abscess, which is the kind of medical disaster that was depressingly common before antibiotics. Suddenly Mary was a widow at 18, no longer Queen of France, and facing a choice about what to do with her life. She could have stayed in France and remarried, but Scotland needed a monarch who was actually in Scotland, and Mary decided to return to claim her throne. This was arguably her first major mistake, though to be fair, she didn't have great options. Scotland in 1561 was a mess. While Mary had been in France, Scotland had undergone a Protestant Reformation led by John Knox, a preacher who made English Puritans look laid back, and who had some seriously problematic views about female rulers. He'd literally written a treatise called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, which was as charming as it sounds and which argued that female rule was unnatural and ungodly. Mary, a Catholic queen returning to a newly Protestant country, led by someone who'd written a best-selling book about how women shouldn't be in charge, was walking into a situation that was basically designed to fail. But Mary was 19, recently widowed, and convinced she could handle it. She arrived in Scotland in August 1561, immediately realised that Scotland was not France, and spent the next few years trying to navigate between her Catholic faith, her Protestant subjects, her ambitious nobles who all had their own agendas, and John Knox, who treated her to regular lectures about how she was going to hell for being Catholic, and also for being a woman in power, though presumably the Catholic thing bothered him more. Mary needed to remarry and produce an heir, both to secure her own position and to establish the succession. The question was whom to marry. Should she marry a foreign prince and risk alienating her Scottish nobles? Should she marry a Scottish noble and risk creating jealousies and factions? Should she marry someone Elizabeth I would approve of, given that Mary was also Elizabeth's heir and the relationship between Scotland and England was complicated at best? In 1565, Mary made her choice, and it was spectacularly bad. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, her first cousin, who was tall, handsome, Catholic, and had a strong claim to both the Scottish and English thrones. On paper, this looked like a solid political match. In reality, Darnley was vain, arrogant, jealous, probably alcoholic, and had the political judgment of a concussed pigeon. At first, Mary was infatuated with him, which is understandable because he was physically attractive and she was 22 and probably tired of being a widow. She made him king consort, which gave him more power than he deserved and immediately annoyed the Scottish nobles who didn't think this English-raised pretty boy should have authority over them. The marriage went downhill fast. Darnley wanted the crown matrimonial, which would have made him a full co-ruler and allowed him to continue as king even if Mary died. Mary refused, probably because she'd figured out that Darnley was useless at politics and giving him more power would be a disaster. Darnley responded to this rejection like a mature adult would, by getting drunk a lot, treating Mary badly, and eventually participating in a plot to murder her private secretary, David Rizzio. Now there were rumours that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair, which probably weren't true. Rizzio was Italian, Catholic, and useful to Mary as a secretary and music teacher, but there's no real evidence they were sleeping together. But Darnley was convinced they were, or at least he used the rumours as justification for what happened next. In March 1566, when Mary was 6 months pregnant, a group of conspirators including Darnley burst into Mary's supper chamber at Holyrood Palace, dragged Rizzio away from her, and stabbed him to death. They killed him right outside Mary's presence, in a hallway where she could hear him screaming for her to save him. There were 56 stab wounds in his body, which was excessive even by 16th century murder standards. Darnley's dagger was left in the corpse, just to make absolutely sure everyone knew he was involved. This was traumatic on multiple levels. Mary was pregnant, she'd just witnessed a murder, and her own husband had been part of the conspiracy. The message was clear. Darnley and his co-conspirators could get to people close to Mary, could violate her private chambers, and could kill with impunity. It was also possibly an attempt to cause Mary to miscarry, which would have solved several problems for Darnley and his allies. But Mary was made of tougher stuff than they'd anticipated. She talked Darnley into betraying his co-conspirators, which wasn't hard given his limited intelligence and loyalty, escaped from Edinburgh, gave birth to a healthy son in June 1566, and basically ensured the succession while her enemies were still scrambling. The son, James, would eventually inherit both the Scottish and English thrones, unifying the crowns that Henry VIII had wanted to unite through marriage decades earlier. But in 1566, James's birth was mainly important because it gave Mary a male heir and strengthened her position. It also made Darnley expendable. Mary couldn't divorce him without making James illegitimate, but she clearly couldn't trust him, couldn't rely on him, and couldn't forgive him for the Rizzio murder. Their marriage was essentially over in everything but name, and everyone at court knew it. Darnley was isolated, unpopular, and increasingly paranoid, which was entirely his own fault but also made him dangerous. And this is where James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, enters the story, and where everything gets so much worse so much faster. Bothwell was a Scottish border lord, which meant he was tough, ruthless, and experienced in the kind of low-level warfare and raiding that characterised the Scottish-English border region. He was Protestant, which should have made him an ally of the Reformation faction, but he was loyal to Mary personally, which made him valuable to her and suspicious to everyone else. He'd served Mary well during various crises, including helping her escape after the Rizzio murder, and by late 1566 he was one of her most trusted advisors. He was also recently married to Jean Gordon, but that wasn't going to be a problem for long because Bothwell and Subtlety were not close acquaintances. He was reportedly short, rough-featured, and not conventionally attractive, but he projected power and confidence in a way that apparently appealed to Mary after years of dealing with her weak, treacherous husband. Where Darnley was all surface charm and no substance, Bothwell was all substance and no charm, and after the Rizzio disaster, Mary probably found that reassuring. In early February 1567, Darnley was recovering from either smallpox or syphilis, accounts vary, at a house called Kirker Field on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Mary visited him several times, suggesting a possible reconciliation, though historians debate whether she was sincere or just maintaining appearances. On the night of February 9-10, Mary attended a wedding masque at Holyrood Palace. Around 2 a.m, a massive explosion destroyed Kirker Field. The house was blown up with enough gunpowder to be heard across Edinburgh. When people dug through the rubble, they found Darnley's body in the garden, along with the body of his servant. Neither had any wounds from the explosion. They'd been strangled. Someone had blown up the house to cover up a murder that had already happened, which was both excessive and poorly thought out, because it drew attention to the killing rather than making it look like an accident. Everyone knew this was murder. The question was who'd ordered it. Suspicion immediately fell on Bothwell, who'd been seen near Kirker Field that night, and who had the most obvious motive. Darnley was his rival for influence over the Queen. But suspicion also fell on Mary herself, because getting rid of her useless, treacherous husband would solve a lot of her problems. Placards appeared around Edinburgh accusing Bothwell and Mary of the murder. Public opinion turned against the Queen. This should have been the moment when Mary distanced herself from Bothwell, had him investigated, and salvaged what she could of the situation. Instead, she did the opposite. She defended Bothwell. She insisted on his innocence. And when Bothwell was brought to trial for Darnley's murder, a show trial where he was predictably acquitted because he'd surrounded the courthouse with his armed supporters, Mary continued to trust him and keep him close. This was politically suicidal. Whether or not Mary had actually been involved in planning Darnley's murder, being seen to protect the prime suspect while her husband's body was barely cold looked absolutely terrible. And then things got dramatically worse. In April 1567, Mary was travelling from Stirling to Edinburgh when Bothwell intercepted her with 800 armed men. He kidnapped the Queen, rode with her to Dunbar Castle, and according to most accounts, raped her. This is one of the more controversial moments in Mary's story because there's debate about whether it was actually rape, or whether Mary consented or even planned the abduction as a way to force a marriage that would otherwise be impossible to justify. But the contemporary accounts mostly describe it as an assault. Mary's own letters suggest she felt violated and threatened, and even if she'd been complicit in planning an abduction, that doesn't mean she consented to everything that followed. Bothwell, meanwhile, quickly divorced his wife Jean Gordon, who'd been married to him for less than a year, and who must have been absolutely thrilled to be dumped so Bothwell could marry the Queen he'd just abducted and assaulted. The divorce was rushed through on the grounds of his adultery, which was probably the least of his crimes at this point, but was legally expedient. On May 15, 1567, barely 3 months after Darnley's murder and 2 weeks after the abduction, Mary married Bothwell in a Protestant ceremony at Holyrood Palace. This was, without exaggeration, one of the worst political decisions any monarch has ever made. Mary had married a man widely suspected of murdering her previous husband, who'd kidnapped and likely raped her, who was already married when he did all this, and who was thoroughly hated by both Protestant and Catholic factions of the Scottish nobility. There was literally no constituency that supported this marriage except Bothwell himself, and possibly Mary, though what she was actually thinking at this point is one of history's great mysteries. The best interpretation is that Mary felt she had no choice. Bothwell had compromised her reputation, possibly gotten her pregnant, and she needed to legitimize the situation. The worst interpretation is that she was genuinely infatuated with Bothwell despite everything, and made a catastrophic romantic choice that destroyed her reign. The truth is probably somewhere in between, complicated by trauma, political desperation, and the impossible situation Mary had found herself in. Whatever her motivations, the marriage was a disaster. The Scottish nobles, who'd been increasingly unhappy with Mary's rule, now had the perfect excuse to rebel. Within weeks of the marriage, a coalition of nobles had raised an army against Mary and Bothwell. Mary tried to rally support but found almost none. The Kirker Field murder and the hasty marriage to Bothwell had destroyed what remained of her political capital. At Carberry Hill in June 1567, Mary's small army faced the rebel forces, negotiations broke down, and Mary agreed to surrender in exchange for Bothwell being allowed to escape. This was the last time Mary ever saw Bothwell. He fled to Scandinavia, where he was eventually imprisoned by the Danish authorities and died insane in prison in 1578. Mary, meanwhile, was taken to Edinburgh, where crowds screamed "Burn the whore" at her, which was not exactly a positive reception for someone who'd been queen barely 6 years earlier. She was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle and forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James. She was 24 years old and her reign was over. Mary managed to escape from Lochleven in May 1568, which showed she still had some political skill and some loyal supporters. She raised an army, tried to fight to regain her throne, and lost decisively at the Battle of Langside. Rather than being captured by her enemies in Scotland, she made the fatal decision to flee south across the border into England, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth I and asking for help in regaining her throne. This was possibly an even worse decision than marrying Bothwell. Elizabeth had no interest in helping Mary regain power. Mary was a Catholic claimant to the English throne, and helping her would mean antagonising Elizabeth's Protestant Scottish allies and possibly facing a Catholic rival with an army and a restored kingdom. Instead, Elizabeth had Mary investigated for her role in Darnley's murder, held a series of hearings that were basically show trials, and when nothing conclusive could be proven, decided the safest course of action was to just keep Mary imprisoned indefinitely in England. Mary spent the next 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner, moved from castle to castle, never allowed to return to Scotland or to travel freely, and serving as a focal point for every Catholic plot against Elizabeth's life. She didn't choose this role, particularly at first, but as the years dragged on and it became clear Elizabeth would never let her go, Mary became increasingly involved in plots to overthrow Elizabeth and claim the English throne for herself. The final plot, the Babington Plot of 1586, gave Elizabeth the excuse she needed to finally eliminate the problem Mary represented. Mary was tried for treason, found guilty, and beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. She was 44 years old, had spent nearly half her life in prison, and died dressed in red, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. So what went so catastrophically wrong with Mary Stuart? How did a queen who'd been raised at the French court, who'd ruled France alongside her first husband, who'd returned to Scotland with every advantage except religious compatibility with her subjects, end up losing her throne at 24 and losing her head at 44? The obvious answer is Bothwell. The marriage to him was the specific decision that destroyed Mary's reign and ended any chance she had of maintaining her throne. But that's not quite the whole story, because Mary had already been in serious political trouble before Bothwell became her husband. The Darnley marriage had been disastrous. The Rizzio murder had been traumatic and politically damaging. Mary's inability to manage the competing factions of Scottish nobility had left her increasingly isolated. Bothwell was the final catastrophic mistake, but he wasn't the only mistake. What makes Mary's story so tragic is that she was in many ways intelligent, capable, and devoted to being a good queen. She genuinely tried to rule well. She tried to balance Protestant and Catholic interests. She tried to maintain Scottish independence while managing the complicated relationship with England. She had courage. Her escape from Lochleven and her willingness to raise an army to fight for her throne showed she wasn't someone who gave up easily. But she made terrible choices in her personal life, and those choices had catastrophic political consequences. Compare Mary to her cousin Elizabeth, and the contrast is instructive. Both were female monarchs in an era that was deeply sceptical of female rule. Both faced religious conflicts and political factions. Both had to navigate the dangerous waters of royal marriage and succession. But Elizabeth's response was to never commit, never give anyone power over her, never let her personal feelings compromise her political position. Mary's response was to follow her heart, to trust the wrong people, to believe that personal loyalty and romantic attachment could overcome political reality. The Bothwell marriage is the perfect example of this. Even if we give Mary every benefit of the doubt, even if we assume Bothwell forced her into the marriage, that she felt she had no choice, that she was traumatized and desperate, the political calculation should have been obvious. Marrying the prime suspect in her husband's murder was going to destroy what remained of her political support. There was no scenario where this ended well for her, but she did it anyway, whether out of desperation or affection or coercion, and it cost her everything. What's interesting is how the Bothwell marriage compares to other romantic disasters we've discussed. Anne Boleyn's relationship with Henry VIII started as a calculated risk that paid off spectacularly before it went wrong. Catherine Howard's affairs were the actions of a young woman with poor judgment but also very limited agency. Elizabeth's relationships with her favourites were carefully managed exercises in emotional manipulation that served her political interests. But Mary and Bothwell was just chaos. There was no careful calculation, no long-term strategy, no managed risk. It was impulsive, destructive, and played out in full view of a Scottish nobility that was already looking for excuses to remove Mary from power. The tragedy is compounded by what happened after Mary fled to England. She spent 19 years in captivity, watching her son James grow up without her, watching Scotland move on without her, watching Elizabeth refuse to either release her or definitively charge her with crimes. It was a kind of limbo that must have been psychologically devastating. Mary had been Queen of 2 countries by age 17. By age 24 she was a prisoner, and she remained a prisoner with increasingly little hope of freedom for nearly 2 decades. During those years, Mary's relationship with Bothwell took on an almost mythical quality in the historical record. She apparently never stopped considering herself his wife, even after Bothwell's death. She defended him in her letters. She maintained that she'd been more sinned against than sinning, which was partly true but also overlooked her own agency in the catastrophic choices she'd made. The marriage to Bothwell became, in Mary's narrative of her own life, evidence of how she'd been victimised by ambitious men and by her ungrateful subjects. It was easier, perhaps, than admitting that she'd made terrible choices and paid a terrible price. But here's the thing about Mary Stuart. Her story has been romanticised for centuries, turned into plays and poems and novels and movies that portray her as a tragic heroine destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. And there's some truth to that. She was dealt a difficult hand. Scotland was a mess. The religious conflicts of the Reformation made governing nearly impossible. Her first husband died young, leaving her a widow with limited options. Darnley was a disaster she couldn't have fully predicted. The Rizzio murder was traumatic. Bothwell's abduction might have been assault. But Mary also made choices, and those choices had consequences. She chose to marry Darnley despite warning signs about his character. She chose to trust Bothwell even after Darnley's murder made him politically radioactive. She chose to marry Bothwell despite knowing it would destroy her remaining support. She chose to flee to England rather than staying in Scotland or fleeing to France. These weren't choices she made in a vacuum. They were constrained by circumstance, gender expectations, political reality, and sometimes by force. But they were still choices, and Mary bears some responsibility for how they turned out. The comparison with Elizabeth is especially poignant because they were cousins. They corresponded extensively, and they never met face to face despite being political rivals for decades. Elizabeth saw in Mary everything she'd determined not to be. A woman who let her heart rule her head, who made herself vulnerable through marriage, who trusted the wrong people and paid the ultimate price. Mary saw in Elizabeth everything she couldn't achieve: political stability, long-term rule, respect from her subjects, and most painfully, freedom. Their relationship was complicated by rivalry, religion, and succession questions. But underneath all that was a kind of gendered tragedy about the different ways female monarchs could fail or succeed. Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned because Mary represented a threat to Elizabeth's throne, but also because Mary represented a cautionary tale that Elizabeth never wanted to embody. Mary was proof that female monarchs who made the wrong romantic choices could lose everything. Elizabeth was determined not to make those same mistakes, even if it meant dying alone and unmarried. The Bothwell affair, seen in this light, was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a political disaster that reinforced every negative stereotype about female rule. It suggested that women couldn't separate their personal feelings from their political judgment. It implied that women needed strong men to guide them and would fall apart when they chose the wrong men. It gave ammunition to people like John Knox, who'd argued all along that women shouldn't rule, and it provided a stark contrast to Elizabeth, who was busy demonstrating that a woman could rule successfully if she just never let anyone close enough to hurt her. There's something profoundly sad about Mary's 19 years of imprisonment. She'd been so many things: Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, a young woman with potential and intelligence and courage. She became a prisoner, a pawn in plots she increasingly couldn't control, and eventually a martyr for the Catholic cause. The passionate, impulsive woman who'd married Bothwell became the middle-aged woman writing letters from captivity, trying to justify her past choices while knowing she'd never escape the consequences. When Mary was finally executed in 1587, it was ostensibly for her role in the Babington plot against Elizabeth's life. But really, she was being executed for everything she represented: the threat to Elizabeth's throne, the Catholic alternative to Protestant England, and perhaps most of all, the living reminder of what happened when a queen chose passion over politics. Elizabeth reportedly agonised over signing Mary's death warrant, and whether that anguish was genuine or political theatre, it showed how complicated their relationship had become. They were cousins, fellow queens, women navigating the same impossible situation of female rule in a masculine world. But they'd made different choices, and those choices had led one to enduring success and the other to scaffold. The Earl of Bothwell, meanwhile, died insane in a Danish prison in 1578, chained to a pillar in conditions that were appalling even by 16th century standards. He'd spent the last decade of his life imprisoned, going gradually mad, forgotten by everyone except historians who would puzzle over his role in Mary's downfall for centuries to come. His brief moment of power and his disastrous marriage to Mary had destroyed both their lives, and unlike Mary, he didn't even get the dignity of martyrdom. He just died, alone and insane, having achieved nothing except helping to destroy a queen. This is what makes the Mary Stuart story so tragically different from the other royal romantic disasters we've discussed. Henry VIII destroyed multiple women but lived a long life and died still convinced of his own righteousness. Elizabeth I managed her favourites successfully and died peacefully after 45 years of rule. But Mary and Bothwell destroyed each other. Their relationship, whether it was based on genuine passion, political desperation, or predatory abuse, ended up costing Mary her throne and eventually her life, and costing Bothwell his freedom, his sanity, and any historical legacy beyond being the man who ruined Mary Stuart. The Scottish tragedy, as it's often called, was really a tragedy about what happens when personal desire, political necessity, and genuine danger all collide in the worst possible way. Mary needed to remarry after Darnley's death, but she needed to choose carefully and with political wisdom. Instead, she ended up with Bothwell, whether through her own choice or through his coercion, and that marriage became the excuse her enemies needed to remove her from power. Everything that followed, the abdication, the imprisonment, the plots, the execution, stemmed from that catastrophic moment when Mary became Bothwell's wife and stopped being Scotland's queen. What's particularly cruel is that Mary's son James, who became King James VI of Scotland and eventually James III of England, got everything Mary had wanted. He inherited both thrones, uniting Scotland and England under one crown. He ruled successfully for decades. He did what Mary had tried and failed to do. He maintained power, navigated religious conflicts, and created a lasting dynasty. But he did it by being the kind of cautious, calculating monarch that Mary had never quite managed to be. He learned from his mother's mistakes by watching what happened when you let personal feelings drive political decisions. In the end, the story of Mary Queen of Scots and the Earl of Bothwell is a reminder that being royal doesn't protect you from making catastrophically bad romantic choices, and that sometimes those choices have consequences that echo through centuries. Mary's tragedy was that she had the intelligence and capability to be a successful monarch, but she made decisions in her personal life that destroyed her political position. Whether those decisions were forced on her by circumstance and by Bothwell himself, or whether she made them willingly out of desperation or affection, the result was the same. A queen who lost her throne, her freedom, and eventually her life because of one disastrous marriage to one utterly wrong man. It's tempting to wonder what would have happened if Mary had never met Bothwell, or if she'd had the political acumen to distance herself from him after Darnley's murder, or if she'd chosen to flee to France instead of England after losing at Langside. But historical what-ifs don't change what actually happened, which is that Mary Stuart went from being queen of two countries to being a prisoner for 19 years to being a martyr, and at the centre of her downfall was a relationship with a border lord who should never have gotten anywhere near the levers of power. This is the Scottish tragedy in its essence, not a romantic tale of star-crossed lovers, but a political disaster wrapped in personal catastrophe, a story of how one relationship could destroy a reign and end a life. And it stands as one of the great cautionary tales in royal history about what happens when monarchs forget that their personal lives are never really personal, that their romantic choices are always political choices, and that choosing the wrong partner can cost not just happiness but kingdoms, freedom, and eventually life itself. Mary Stuart deserved better than Bothwell, better than Darnley, better than John Knox and the Scottish nobility and the impossible situation she inherited. But what she deserved and what she got were two very different things, and the gap between them is filled with poor decisions, bad timing, political intrigue, religious conflict, and one catastrophically terrible marriage that destroyed everything she'd worked for and condemned her to decades of imprisonment before her final walk to the scaffold. That's the real tragedy of Mary Queen of Scots, not that she loved unwisely, but that loving unwisely cost her absolutely everything. Now, if the Tudor and Stuart eras showed us what happened when royal romantic disasters played out with crowns and kingdoms at stake, the Regency period gives us something slightly different. What happened when aristocratic women with too much time, too little supervision, and access to romantic poets decided to make spectacularly bad decisions that ruined their reputations instead of their kingdoms. Welcome to the story of Lady Caroline Lamb and Lord Byron, which is basically what you'd get if you combined a modern celebrity stalking situation with early 19th century social media, except instead of Twitter, people wrote vicious letters and gossipy novels about each other. Caroline Lamb was born in 1785 into one of the most powerful families in England. The Spencers, yes, the same family that would later produce Princess Diana, so apparently making questionable romantic choices while the public watched, was a family tradition that lasted centuries. Her father was the 3rd Earl of Bessborough, her mother was a society beauty, and Caroline grew up in a world of incredible privilege, political connections, and basically zero boundaries or discipline, which turned out to be a problematic combination. The Regency era was a peculiar time in English history. King George III was increasingly incapacitated by what was probably porphyria, but which everyone at the time thought was just madness, so his son ruled as Prince Regent, and the whole period took on this quality of performative excess. The Regency was all about being seen, being talked about, being at the centre of society's attention. Fashion was extreme, architecture was grandiose, poetry was melodramatic, and everyone who was anyone lived their lives like they were performing in a play for an audience of their peers. Privacy wasn't valued, publicity was. This was the world Caroline Lamb was born into, and she embraced it with an enthusiasm that would eventually destroy her social standing. Caroline was tiny, elfin, with short blonde hair that she sometimes cut even shorter in defiance of fashion, and a personality that can best be described as a lot. She was intelligent, well-read, artistic, emotionally volatile, impulsive, and completely unconcerned with what other people thought she should do, which made her fascinating at parties and absolutely exhausting to actually know. She wrote poetry, she painted, she was interested in politics, and she had opinions about everything, which was not exactly considered attractive in a Regency woman who was supposed to be decorative and agreeable. In 1805, at age 20, Caroline married William Lamb, who would later become Lord Melbourne and eventually Prime Minister. On paper, this was a good match. William was intelligent, well-connected, tolerant of Caroline's eccentricities, and genuinely fond of her despite her increasingly erratic behaviour. In practice, the marriage was complicated from the start. William's family, particularly his mother Lady Melbourne, never quite accepted Caroline. They found her too wild, too emotional, too unwilling to conform to expectations. And Caroline, for her part, found conventional married life boring and started looking for excitement elsewhere. For the first few years, the marriage functioned reasonably well. Caroline and William had a son, Augustus, who unfortunately had developmental disabilities that became more apparent as he grew older. This was devastating for Caroline, who blamed herself and who poured her emotional energy into caring for him, while also becoming increasingly restless and dissatisfied with her life. She wanted passion, drama, recognition as something more than just a wife and mother. She wanted to be extraordinary. Enter George Gordon Byron, better known as Lord Byron, in March 1812. Byron had just published the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and as he famously wrote later, he awoke one morning and found myself famous. This was not an exaggeration. Byron became the Regency equivalent of a rock star overnight. Dangerous, brooding, handsome in that slightly unsettling way, where you couldn't tell if he wanted to seduce you or write a poem about your inevitable death, and blessed with the kind of scandalous reputation that made mothers warn their daughters about him, which of course only made the daughters more interested. Byron was also, it should be noted, a magnificently problematic person. He had affairs with married women as a hobby. He wrote poetry that was brilliant but also deeply cynical about love and relationships. He had a clubfoot that he was self-conscious about, which contributed to his brooding persona. He was rumoured to have had an incestuous relationship with his half-sister Augusta, which may or may not have been true, but which he certainly didn't go out of his way to deny because he enjoyed shocking people. He was essentially catnip for anyone who wanted to have an affair with someone completely inappropriate, and Caroline Lamb wanted exactly that. They met at a party at Lady Westmoreland's house, and the attraction was immediate and mutual, which was unfortunate for literally everyone involved. Caroline supposedly saw Byron across the room and declared him mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which is one of the most famous quotes about Byron, and which suggests Caroline knew exactly what she was getting into. The fact that she pursued the relationship anyway tells you everything about her judgment and her priorities. The affair started almost immediately, and Caroline had absolutely no interest in being discreet about it, which was a problem because discretion was the entire point of aristocratic affairs in Regency England. You could have affairs, everyone had affairs, but you were supposed to be subtle about it. You met in private. You didn't flaunt it in public. You certainly didn't make a spectacle of yourself in ways that forced society to acknowledge what was happening, because once society had to publicly acknowledge your affair, they had to condemn it, and then you were socially ruined. Caroline understood none of this, or more accurately, she understood it and didn't care. She visited Byron openly at his apartments. She wrote him letters, dozens of letters, possibly hundreds, that were passionate, possessive, and increasingly unhinged. She sent him locks of her hair. She dressed as a page boy to sneak into his rooms, which was the kind of thing that seemed romantic in her head, but was actually just creating gossip that spread through London society like wildfire. She made scenes in public. She appeared at parties looking wild-eyed and dishevelled. She basically did everything possible to ensure that everyone in London knew she was having an affair with Byron, and then acted shocked when people criticised her for it. Byron, for his part, was initially intrigued by Caroline. She was different from other women he'd known, more intense, more creative, more willing to completely ignore social conventions. But Byron's interest in women tended to last about as long as it took for them to become inconvenient, and Caroline became very inconvenient very quickly. Her constant visits, her emotional scenes, her possessiveness, it all started to bore and irritate him within months of the affair starting. By the summer of 1812, Byron was already trying to extricate himself from the relationship, which Caroline absolutely refused to accept. This is where the story shifts from scandalous affair to public catastrophe, because Caroline's response to Byron trying to end things was essentially to double down on every behaviour that had made him want to leave. She became more dramatic. She showed up uninvited at his apartments. She sent more letters. She threatened self-harm. She made scenes. At one point, she tried to stab herself at a party with a pair of scissors when she saw Byron flirting with another woman, which was both a genuine mental health crisis and also absolutely the worst possible way to handle rejection in front of the entire ton. Byron, meanwhile, was rapidly moving from trying to end things gently to actively fleeing from Caroline. He started avoiding places where he knew she'd be. He stopped responding to her letters. He complained about her to friends, which meant those complaints got back to Caroline, which made her even more desperate. It became a vicious cycle where Caroline's increasingly erratic behaviour pushed Byron further away, which made Caroline's behaviour even more erratic, which made Byron even more desperate to escape. Society watched this all unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination, the way you'd watch a carriage accident in slow motion. Caroline was destroying her own reputation with every public scene, every tearful letter that somehow became public knowledge, every desperate attempt to regain Byron's attention. Her husband William was humiliated and furious but also strangely loyal. He didn't divorce her, which would have been his right given her blatant adultery, probably because he genuinely cared about her despite everything, and could see that she was spiralling into something that looked a lot like a mental breakdown. The affair, if you could still call it that by this point, dragged on through 1812 and into 1813, though Byron had clearly checked out emotionally by the end of 1812. He'd moved on to other women, other affairs, other sources of scandal. Caroline hadn't moved on at all. She was still writing him letters, still showing up places hoping to see him, still making scenes, still refusing to accept that it was over. In July 1813, William Lamb finally had enough and essentially exiled Caroline to Ireland, removing her from London society in hopes that distance and time would help her recover her senses. This was partly for Caroline's own good. She was clearly not coping well with the end of the affair, and partly to stop the constant public scandal that was damaging the Lamb family's reputation. Caroline went, but not quietly. She continued writing to Byron. She convinced herself that he was being kept from her by malicious forces rather than by his own choice to end things. She created an elaborate fantasy where they were tragic lovers separated by cruel circumstances, rather than two people who'd had a brief affair that ended badly. While in Ireland, Caroline did something that would define her legacy and also ensure she could never fully return to polite society. She wrote a novel. Glenavon, published anonymously in 1816, was a thinly veiled account of her affair with Byron. And when I say thinly veiled, I mean you could see right through the veil, even if you were standing in another room with your eyes closed. The main character, Lord Ruthven Glenavon, was obviously Byron, Dangerous, seductive, morally corrupt, fascinating. The heroine Calantha was obviously Caroline, passionate, betrayed, destroyed by her love for an unworthy man. Other characters were clearly based on real people in Caroline's social circle, including unflattering portraits of her mother-in-law Lady Melbourne and various other society figures who'd criticised her. Publishing Glenarvan was Caroline's revenge on Byron and on the society that had condemned her, but it was also social suicide. The novel confirmed everything scandalous that people had suspected or known about the affair. It aired private matters in the most public way possible. It exposed not just Caroline and Byron, but dozens of other people who found themselves thinly disguised in its pages. And it violated the fundamental rule of Regency scandal. You could do scandalous things, but you didn't write about them in a way that forced society to acknowledge them officially. The reaction was swift and brutal. Glenarvan was a bestseller, because of course it was, scandal always sells, but it also destroyed what remained of Caroline's reputation. She was cut by former friends. She was no longer invited to respectable houses. Even people who'd sympathised with her during the affair turned against her for making everything so public. Her husband William stood by her, which was more than she deserved given that she'd just published a novel about her adultery. But even his loyalty couldn't protect her from the social consequences of what she'd done. Byron, meanwhile, was furious about Glenarvan, not because it exposed their affair, his own reputation could handle that, but because the portrait of him was unflattering in ways he found insulting. He wrote poems mocking Caroline. He made cutting remarks about her in letters that he knew would circulate through society. He essentially declared open warfare on her reputation, which was unnecessary given that she'd already destroyed it herself. But Byron never could resist kicking someone when they were down if there was poetry to be made from it. The years after Glenarvan were increasingly sad for Caroline. She tried to write more novels, but none achieved the notoriety of the first, partly because the novelty had worn off, and partly because she wasn't actually a very good novelist when she wasn't fueled by obsession and revenge. She continued to live with William, but the marriage was essentially over emotionally even if it continued legally. She became more erratic, more isolated, more dependent on alcohol and laudanum to cope with her social exile and her mental health struggles. The vibrant, if chaotic, young woman who'd taken London by storm in 1812 gradually became a figure of pity and ridicule. In 1824, Byron died in Greece, where he'd gone to fight for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. His death was a massive cultural event, the great romantic poet dying young in a foreign land for a noble cause. It was exactly the kind of death Byron would have wanted, dramatic and historically significant. When Caroline heard the news, she reportedly said, "I have lost my first and almost my only love," which suggests she'd spent the 12 years since the affair ended still not accepting that Byron had left her because he wanted to, not because he was forced to by circumstance. Caroline saw Byron's funeral procession by chance, encountering it while out driving. The shock of seeing his coffin apparently triggered some kind of mental crisis. She became increasingly unstable after this, her health deteriorating rapidly. In 1828, 4 years after Byron's death, Caroline Lamb died at age 42. The official cause was probably related to her long-term alcohol and laudanum use, but really she'd been destroying herself slowly for years, and Byron's death had just accelerated the process. So what do we make of Caroline Lamb and her destructive obsession with Byron? On one level, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when you pursue a relationship with someone who clearly doesn't want it anymore, and when you make private matters public in ways that destroy your own reputation. Caroline's downfall was largely self-inflicted. Byron didn't force her to make scenes in public, to write obsessive letters, to publish a novel exposing their affair. She made those choices and she paid the price for them. But on another level, Caroline's story is about mental health in an era that had no framework for understanding or treating it. Her behaviour, the impulsivity, the emotional volatility, the obsessive fixation on Byron, the self-destructive choices, looks a lot like what we'd now recognise as a mental health crisis, possibly bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. The Regency era had no concept of these conditions and no treatment for them beyond exile, shame and sedation with laudanum. Caroline needed help, not scandal and social ostracism, but the society she lived in couldn't provide that help because it didn't understand mental illness as an illness, rather than as a moral failing. There's also something to be said about the double standard Caroline faced. Byron had affairs with married women constantly, treated women badly as a matter of course, and wrote poetry about his sexual exploits and moral corruption. He was celebrated for it. It made him more interesting, more attractive, more legendary. Caroline had one affair, admittedly one that she conducted in the most public and catastrophic way possible, and she was socially destroyed. She lost her reputation, her friends, her place in society. She spent the rest of her life as an exile from the world she'd been born into. This wasn't fair, but fairness wasn't really the point. Regency society had different rules for men and women, and those rules were brutally enforced when women violated them. Men could be rake and libertines and romantic heroes. Women who behaved similarly were fallen women, ruined, unmarriageable, socially dead. Caroline's tragedy was partly that she refused to accept these rules, and partly that she violated them in such a public, undeniable way that society had no choice but to punish her. The relationship between Caroline and Byron also illustrates something important about how the Romantic movement's ideas about passionate love and emotional authenticity could be destructive when applied to real life. The Romantics celebrated intense emotion, spontaneous action, living according to your feelings rather than social conventions. This was great in poetry, where it produced beautiful, moving work. In real life, it produced Caroline Lamb, someone so convinced that her feelings for Byron were profound and meaningful that she destroyed herself pursuing them, even after it became clear that Byron didn't share those feelings. Byron himself was a product of Romanticism's contradictions. He wrote beautiful poetry about love and passion, but he treated actual people, especially women, with casual cruelty. He cultivated an image of the tortured, passionate hero, but he was actually quite calculating about his reputation and his relationships. He inspired intense devotion from women like Caroline, then mocked them for that devotion when it became inconvenient. He was, in many ways, the worst possible person for someone like Caroline to fixate on, because he encouraged the obsession just enough to keep it going, but never enough to actually commit to anything real. What's particularly cruel about Caroline's story is how much it overshadowed everything else about her. She was intelligent, creative, politically informed, and genuinely talented in some ways. Her poetry wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. Her novels, apart from Glenarvan, showed some skill even if they weren't masterpieces. She had the potential to be remembered as a minor literary figure of the Regency era, someone interesting in her own right rather than just as a footnote to Byron's biography. But the Byron affair and the publication of Glenarvan meant that Caroline would always be remembered primarily as Byron's crazy ex, the woman who couldn't take no for an answer, the cautionary tale about what happens when you make a spectacle of yourself over a man who doesn't love you back. Everything else she did, everything else she was, got swallowed up by that one catastrophic relationship and its aftermath. There's also something depressingly modern about Caroline's story. The patterns she exhibited, the obsessive behavior after a relationship ended, the inability to accept rejection, the public scenes, the desperate attempts to regain someone's attention would be recognized today as stalking. The fact that society mocked her for it rather than being concerned about her mental health. The fact that Byron actively encouraged it at times because he enjoyed the attention and drama. The fact that everyone treated it as entertainment rather than as a crisis. These all speak to how poorly we've historically dealt with mental health issues and relationship dysfunction. Caroline was clearly suffering. The affair with Byron might have been the trigger, but her behaviour suggests deeper problems that predated Byron and that would have manifested in other ways even if they'd never met. She needed treatment, support, and probably medication. What she got was scandal, mockery, social exile, and eventually self-medication with alcohol and laudanum that hastened her death. The parallel to Diana Spencer, Caroline's distant descendant, is interesting to consider. Both were aristocratic women who married into prominent families. Both struggled within those marriages. Both had very public romantic disasters that were played out in front of an watching nation. Both were treated as entertainment rather than as people in distress. Both died relatively young after years of struggling with mental health and public scrutiny. The Spencer women apparently had terrible luck when it came to navigating the intersection of personal life and public attention. But where Diana eventually became a sympathetic figure and her struggles led to conversations about mental health and the cruelty of media attention, Caroline never got that redemption arc. She died as she'd lived for the last decade of her life, pitied, mocked, and fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone around her. The one person who stood by her, her husband William, eventually remarried after her death and went on to become Prime Minister, which suggests he'd been capable of moving on from Caroline in ways she'd never been capable of moving on from Byron. The Glenarvan novel itself is interesting as a historical artifact, beyond just its scandalous content. It shows how Caroline saw herself and her affair with Byron as a tragic heroine destroyed by her love for an unworthy man. The novel's heroine, Calantha, is passionate but virtuous, destroyed not by her own choices but by Glenarvan's cruelty and society's harshness. This was clearly how Caroline wanted people to see her story, as a tragedy where she was the victim rather than as a scandal where she was the architect of her own ruin. But the reading public didn't buy it, probably because they'd watched the actual events unfold and knew that Caroline had made choices that contributed to her downfall. You couldn't be the victim of circumstances when you'd actively created those circumstances through your own behaviour. Publishing the novel was an attempt to control the narrative of her own story, but it backfired because it just confirmed everyone's worst opinions about her judgment and her character. What's sad is that buried in Glenarvan, beneath all the scandalous content and the thinly veiled portraits of real people, there's actually some interesting commentary on Regency Society's treatment of women, on the dangers of romantic idealism, on the gap between public persona and private reality. Caroline had insights worth sharing, but they got lost in the scandal of the book's existence and in readers' eagerness to decode which characters represented which real people. The Byron-Caroline affair also had ripple effects beyond just the two principals. It damaged Caroline's family's reputation. Her mother-in-law, Lady Melbourne, never forgave her. Her husband William was humiliated. Her son Augustus grew up in the shadow of his mother's scandal. It became a topic of gossip and speculation that entertained Regency Society for years. It influenced how Byron was perceived and how he presented himself in his later years, and it established a template for how destructive celebrity obsession could be, decades before anything like modern celebrity culture existed. In some ways, Caroline Lamb was ahead of her time, just not in ways that benefited her. Her refusal to accept the constraints on women's behaviour, her insistence on living according to her own feelings rather than social expectations, her willingness to make her private life public, these would all be more acceptable, even celebrated in later eras. But in the Regency period, they were catastrophic choices that destroyed her socially and contributed to her early death. The tragedy of Caroline Lamb is that she wanted to be extraordinary, and she achieved that goal, just not in the way she'd hoped. She became extraordinarily scandalous, extraordinarily pitied, extraordinarily mocked. She became a cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters for generations. This is what happens when you make a spectacle of yourself over a man, when you refuse to accept rejection, when you air your private matters in public. She became exactly the kind of famous that destroys your life rather than enhancing it. And Byron? He went on to have more affairs, write more poetry, become even more famous, and eventually die heroically in Greece, cementing his status as one of the great romantic poets and personalities. His relationship with Caroline became just another anecdote in his colourful biography, not even one of the more interesting ones. He hurt her profoundly and permanently, and it barely registered in his own life story except as an annoyance and a source of material for cruel jokes. That fundamental inequality, Caroline destroyed herself over Byron, while Byron barely noticed Caroline except as an irritant, is perhaps the most tragic element of the whole story. She gave him everything, emotionally speaking, and he gave her barely anything in return except temporary attention and permanent damage. The relationship was never equal, never reciprocal, never going to end in anything but disaster for Caroline. She just couldn't or wouldn't see that until it was far too late to save herself. In the end, Lady Caroline Lamb's story is a reminder that passionate love can be destructive when it's not reciprocated or when it's pursued without any regard for consequences. It's a reminder that mental health crises don't care about your social class or your aristocratic connections. It's a reminder that public scandal can destroy reputations in ways that private tragedy never could. And it's a reminder that sometimes the person you're most dangerous to is yourself, especially when you're convinced that your feelings justify any behaviour, no matter how self-destructive. Caroline Lamb wanted to be remembered as Byron's great love, as the tragic heroine of a romantic story. Instead, she's remembered as a cautionary tale about obsession, mental illness, and the dangers of making your private disasters into public entertainment. She deserved better treatment, better understanding, better help for her obvious mental health struggles. But she lived in an era that couldn't provide those things, and she made choices that ensured she'd be remembered for her worst moments, rather than for anything else she might have achieved. That's the real tragedy of Lady Caroline Lamb, not that she loved Byron, but that loving Byron became the only thing anyone remembered about her entire life. If Caroline Lamb showed us what happened when passionate obsession collided with Regency social rules, Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, shows us something arguably worse. What happened when you were trapped in a marriage with no escape clause, forced to share your husband with your best friend, and expected to smile about it in public while your life slowly fell apart in private. Welcome to the Georgian aristocracy, where marriage was a business arrangement, love was something you found elsewhere if you found it at all, and the most shocking thing about a love triangle involving a husband, wife, and the wife's best friend was that they all lived together under the same roof for decades. Georgiana Spencer, yes, another Spencer, because apparently this family had a genetic predisposition for romantic disasters spanning centuries, was born in 1757 into one of England's most prominent aristocratic families. Her father was the first Earl Spencer, her mother was a formidable society matron, and Georgiana was raised with every advantage that Georgian England could provide to a girl of her class, which meant she could speak French, play the piano, draw prettily, and had been thoroughly educated in how to be decorative, agreeable, and useful as a political and social asset to whatever husband her parents chose for her. At age 17, barely out of childhood by modern standards, Georgiana was married to William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire. He was 25, spectacularly wealthy. The Devonshire estates produced an income of about $60,000 a year, which in modern money would be somewhere in the tens of millions, and by all accounts, spectacularly boring. Not boring in a harmless way, but boring in that particularly deadly Georgian aristocratic way, where someone has so much money and power that they've never had to develop anything resembling a personality or interpersonal skills. The Duke was quiet, reserved, emotionally distant, and primarily interested in gambling, collecting books, and absolutely nothing else. He was not interested in his new teenage bride except as a person who could produce heirs and look attractive at social events. He was not interested in conversation or romance, or any of the things Georgiana had probably imagined marriage might involve. He was basically a very wealthy, very titled piece of furniture who occasionally acknowledged Georgiana's existence when absolutely necessary. This was not an unusual marriage for the Georgian aristocracy. Arranged marriages based on property and connections rather than affection were standard. But it was particularly stark in this case because Georgiana was so young, so vivacious, and so completely unprepared for the reality of being married to someone who viewed her primarily as a breeding machine and secondarily as a social accessory. She'd gone from being the cherished daughter of a loving family to being the Duchess of Devonshire, one of the most prominent positions a woman could hold in English society, and discovering that prominence came with a price tag that included emotional neglect and a husband who'd rather read a book than talk to her. But Georgiana was nothing if not adaptable. If her marriage was going to be cold and formal, she'd find warmth and excitement elsewhere. She threw herself into London society with an enthusiasm that quickly made her one of the most famous women in England. She became a fashion icon. Her hairstyles were copied, her dresses were imitated, her style was discussed in newspapers and magazines. She was witty, charming, beautiful in the soft, rounded way that was fashionable in the 1780s, and she had a gift for making everyone around her feel important and interesting, which was a valuable skill in a society that ran on flattery and social connections. Georgiana also threw herself into politics, which was unusual for a woman but not unheard of if you were a duchess with the right connections. She campaigned for the Whig Party, the political faction her family and her husband supported. She gave speeches, she hosted political salons, she used her social influence to rally support for Whig candidates. In the 1784 election, she famously went canvassing for Charles James Fox in Westminster, allegedly trading kisses for votes from butchers and tradesmen, which caused a massive scandal, but also helped Fox win his seat. The idea of a duchess, the highest-ranking woman in England below the royal family, kissing commoners in exchange for political support was shocking, but it was also effective, and it made Georgiana even more famous. But all of this, the fashion, the politics, the social whirl, was at least partly compensation for the fact that her marriage was essentially loveless, and her husband barely acknowledged her, except when he needed her to perform her ducal duties. Georgiana wanted affection, attention, emotional connection. The Duke provided none of these things, so Georgiana sought them elsewhere, and in 1782 she found them in the person of Lady Elizabeth Foster. Elizabeth Foster, known as best to her friends, was everything Georgiana was except fortunate. She was beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and trapped in an abusive marriage to John Foster, an Irish politician who treated her terribly, and who eventually more or less abandoned her, keeping their children but providing her with almost no money. Bess was essentially destitute by aristocratic standards, living on the charity of friends and desperate for security and protection. Georgiana met Bess in 1782 at a spa in Bath, where both women were taking the waters for various health complaints, because Georgian aristocrats believed that drinking disgusting mineral water and bathing in it would cure everything from infertility to melancholy. They became friends quickly. Bess was attentive, sympathetic, grateful for Georgiana's kindness, and possibly genuinely fond of her. Georgiana, lonely in her marriage and desperate for emotional connection, embraced Bess's friendship enthusiastically. And then Georgiana made what was either an incredibly naive or incredibly self-destructive decision. She invited Bess to come live with her and the Duke at Devonshire House. The official reason was charity. Bess had nowhere else to go, and Georgiana was helping a friend in need. The actual result was that Georgiana essentially introduced her husband to his next mistress, though it's unclear if she realised that's what she was doing at the time. The Duke, who'd shown minimal interest in his wife beyond using her as a social asset, suddenly developed a very strong interest in Lady Elizabeth Foster. Whether Bess seduced him deliberately as a way to secure her position in the household, or whether the Duke simply found her more interesting than his wife, or whether it was some combination of both, the result was that by 1783, the Duke and Bess were having an affair, and everyone knew it except possibly Georgiana, who seems to have been the last to figure out what was happening. When Georgiana finally realised that her husband and her best friend were sleeping together, her reaction was, and this is where the story gets really depressing, to accept it. Not because she was fine with it, but because she had no other choice. Divorce was virtually impossible for aristocratic women, and would have meant losing access to her children, her social position, and her family's support. Causing a public scandal by throwing out Bess would have humiliated the Duke and damaged Georgiana's own reputation. And confronting the Duke directly would have accomplished nothing except making him angry, because what was Georgiana going to do about it? He was her husband. He had all the legal power. He could do whatever he wanted, and she couldn't stop him. So Georgiana swallowed her pain and humiliation, and accepted that she'd be sharing her husband with her best friend, and moreover, that all three of them would continue living together as if this were a perfectly normal arrangement. The ménage à trois at Devonshire House became one of the worst-kept secrets in Georgian London. Everyone knew. People gossiped about it constantly. But publicly, Georgiana, the Duke and Bess maintained the fiction that they were just good friends who happened to all live together, and society played along with the fiction because the alternative, openly acknowledging what was happening, would have forced someone to do something about it, and nobody wanted that level of scandal. The arrangement was toxic in ways that are almost painful to contemplate. Georgiana and Bess remained friends, or at least maintained the appearance of friendship, which must have required incredible emotional compartmentalization on Georgiana's part. The Duke divided his time between his wife and his mistress, apparently seeing nothing wrong with this arrangement, and possibly enjoying the power dynamic it created. And all of them were trapped in this situation by social convention, by the impossibility of divorce, and by the sheer weight of pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. To make matters worse, Bess got pregnant by the Duke in 1785, which should have been a crisis but was instead handled by everyone involved in the most Georgian way possible. They all just pretended it wasn't happening. Bess was quietly sent to France to give birth, and when she came back everyone acted as if nothing had occurred. The Duke continued sleeping with both Georgiana and Bess. Georgiana continued trying to maintain the appearance of friendship with the woman who was sleeping with her husband and bearing his children. It was a masterclass in repression and denial, and it was slowly destroying Georgiana emotionally. Meanwhile, Georgiana still hadn't produced a male heir for the Duke, which was literally the primary reason she'd been married to him in the first place. She'd had a daughter, Georgiana Dorothy, in 1783, but daughters didn't count for inheritance purposes in the male, primogeniture-obsessed Georgian aristocracy. The Duke needed a son, and Georgiana's failure to provide one was adding to the pressure she was under, because if she couldn't produce an heir, what use was she? The Duke already had Bess for companionship and sex. Georgiana's value was increasingly tied to her ability to get pregnant with a boy, and she wasn't succeeding. Into this already complicated situation came Charles Grey, a young Whig politician who was brilliant, ambitious, handsome, and unlike the Duke, actually capable of having a conversation that lasted more than 5 minutes. Georgiana met Grey through her political work in the late 1780s, and they formed a friendship that quickly became something more, because at this point Georgiana was emotionally starved, stuck in a marriage that was essentially over except on paper, watching her husband father children with her supposed best friend, and desperately unhappy. The affair with Charles Grey was different from the Duke's relationship with Bess in one crucial way. Georgiana genuinely loved Grey, and he apparently loved her back. This wasn't just a physical affair or a political alliance. It was a real romantic relationship, probably the only one Georgiana ever had. For a brief period, she was happy in a way she'd never been with the Duke and never would be again. And then, inevitably, Georgiana got pregnant. In 1791, after years of struggling to conceive with the Duke, Georgiana was finally pregnant again. Except the baby wasn't the Duke's, it was Charles Grey's, and everyone involved knew it. This was a crisis that couldn't be managed by sending Georgiana to France for a few months. Because she was the Duchess of Devonshire, she was famous, and her absence would be noticed and discussed. The solution they came up with was brutal, and shows just how much power the Duke had, and how little Georgiana had, even as a duchess. Georgiana was sent abroad, ostensibly for her health. She gave birth to a daughter, Eliza Courtenay, in France in 1792. The baby was immediately taken from her and given to Charles Grey's family to raise. Georgiana was allowed to see her daughter only rarely and under controlled circumstances. She spent years fighting to have more access to Eliza, writing desperate letters to Grey and his family, begging to be allowed to see her child. Mostly she was refused because the price of the affair with Grey was losing her daughter, and that's just how it was going to be. The affair with Grey ended after Eliza's birth. The Duke had tolerated it up to a point, probably because his own affair with Bess made it hypocritical to object too strenuously to Georgiana having a relationship of her own. But a pregnancy was different. It threatened the legitimate succession, it created scandal that couldn't be hidden, and it gave the Duke leverage to assert control over Georgiana's life in ways he hadn't before. Georgiana was forced to give up Grey, give up their daughter, and return to her marriage and to the three-way living arrangement with the Duke and Bess that had caused her to seek comfort with Grey in the first place. The cruelty of this situation is hard to overstate. The Duke had fathered multiple illegitimate children with Bess, and those children lived with the family or nearby, acknowledged if not quite legitimate. But Georgiana's daughter with Grey was taken from her, hidden away, and Georgiana was allowed only minimal contact, because the rules were different for wives than for husbands, and different for duchesses than for mistresses, and different for women than for men in pretty much every way that mattered. But here's where the story takes an even more bizarre turn. In 1790, Georgiana finally gave birth to the male heir the Duke had been waiting for. William George Spencer Cavendish, future 6th Duke of Devonshire, was born after years of Georgiana trying and failing to produce a son. The timing is interesting. He was born before Eliza Courtenay, which means Georgiana was capable of having children with the Duke. She just hadn't managed to have a boy until then. The Duke finally had his heir, which should have secured Georgiana's position and made her life easier. It didn't. The Duke continued his relationship with Bess. The three-way living arrangement continued. Georgiana's misery continued. She developed various health problems, including a condition affecting her eye that gradually made her lose sight in one eye, which was partly genetic and partly probably stress-related, because stress will absolutely destroy your body if you live with enough of it for enough years. She also developed a serious gambling problem, running up enormous debts that she had to hide from the Duke and that caused her constant anxiety. The gambling is interesting from a psychological perspective, because it was clearly a coping mechanism for the emotional pain of her situation. Georgiana couldn't control her marriage, couldn't control her husband's infidelity, couldn't control the presence of Bess in her household, couldn't see her daughter Eliza. But she could gamble, and in the moment of placing a bet she had agency and excitement and the possibility of winning, even if she usually lost. The debts piled up, eventually reaching tens of thousands of pounds, which was a fortune even for the Duchess of Devonshire, and Georgiana spent years terrified that the Duke would find out and punish her for it. He did find out eventually, and his reaction was about what you'd expect from a man who'd spent years openly conducting an affair with his wife's best friend, while they all lived together. He was furious at Georgiana for her debts, while apparently seeing no irony in being angry at her for any behaviour while his own behaviour had been beyond reproach for their entire marriage. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it was also standard for Georgian aristocratic marriages, where husbands could do essentially whatever they wanted, and wives were expected to be perfectly behaved while their husbands destroyed them emotionally and financially. Through all of this, the affair with Bess, the loss of Eliza, the gambling debts, the health problems, Georgiana maintained her public persona as a fashion icon, political campaigner, and society hostess. She continued to be famous, admired, and influential. She wrote poetry, She hosted salons, she raised her legitimate children, and she pretended that her life was glamorous and enviable. The contrast between the public Georgiana, fashionable, powerful, the Duchess of Devonshire, and the private Georgiana, lonely, heartbroken, trapped, is one of the most striking examples of the Georgian era's obsession with appearances over reality. Bess, meanwhile, had fully entrenched herself in the household. She'd had at least 2 children with the Duke, possibly more. She acted as a second mother to Georgiana's children. She went with the family on trips and to their various estates. She was, to all intents and purposes, the Duke's second wife, except without any of the legal status or security that actual marriage would have provided. This should have been an unstable arrangement, but it lasted for decades, which tells you something about how the 3 people involved had all, in different ways, accepted or resigned themselves to the situation. The question everyone always asks about the Georgiana-Duke-Bess triangle is why Georgiana put up with it. Why didn't she throw Bess out? Why didn't she make more of a public scandal? Why didn't she just leave the Duke, even if divorce wasn't an option? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to the fact that Georgiana had no good options. If she'd thrown out Bess, the Duke would have been angry and probably would have brought Bess back anyway because he could. If she'd caused a public scandal by openly accusing Bess and the Duke, she'd have been the one blamed for disrupting the household and failing to manage the situation discreetly. If she'd left the Duke, she'd have lost access to her children. Maternal custody rights didn't exist in any meaningful way for Georgian women, and would have been financially dependent on her father, who probably wouldn't have supported her in defying her husband. She was trapped, not by physical walls, but by social convention, legal constraints, and economic reality. And there's another factor that's harder to quantify, but that shows up in Georgiana's letters and in accounts from people who knew her. She genuinely seems to have maintained some affection for Bess, even while resenting and being hurt by the affair with the Duke. The female friendship between Georgiana and Bess coexisted uneasily with the romantic triangle, and Georgiana seems to have convinced herself at various points that Bess was as much a victim of the Duke's desires as she was, rather than an active participant who deliberately seduced her friend's husband to secure her own position. This was probably a psychological coping mechanism. It was easier to blame the Duke and to see Bess as a fellow victim than to fully confront the betrayal of her best friend becoming her husband's mistress. But it also speaks to how Georgian women's relationships with each other were complicated by the limited power they had, and the ways they sometimes had to ally with each other, even in situations where they were also rivals, or where one had deeply hurt the other. Georgiana's health deteriorated through the 1790s and early 1800s. The eye condition worsened, eventually leaving her partially blind. She suffered from various other ailments that were probably stress-related or exacerbated by stress. She gained weight as she aged, which wouldn't normally be worth mentioning except that she'd been famous for her beauty and style, and the loss of that beauty was another blow to someone who'd used her appearance and charm as tools for navigating her difficult life. In 1806, Georgiana died at age 48. The official cause was probably an abscess in her liver, but really she'd been slowly dying for years from the accumulated strain of her impossible life. She'd spent 3 decades trapped in a loveless marriage, sharing her husband with her best friend, losing a child she desperately wanted to keep, accumulating debts she couldn't pay, and maintaining a public persona that bore almost no relationship to her private reality. When she finally died, it was probably almost a relief, though her children were devastated, and even the Duke seems to have been genuinely upset, which is about as much emotion as he'd ever shown about anything. And here's the final bitter twist to the story. 3 years after Georgiana's death, the Duke married Bess. The woman who'd been his mistress for nearly 30 years, who'd lived in his household alongside his wife, who'd had his children while pretending to be Georgiana's friend, finally got to be the actual Duchess of Devonshire. She'd waited until Georgiana was safely dead and then married the Duke in 1809, which was both completely predictable and absolutely infuriating in its presumption that now that the inconvenient first wife was gone, they could make their relationship legitimate. Bess lived until 1824, enjoying nearly 15 years as the Duchess of Devonshire after having spent 30 years as the Duke's mistress. She got her security, her position, and her triumph over Georgiana, who'd shown her nothing but kindness and gotten betrayal in return. If there's any justice in the universe, it's that the Duke died in 1811, just 2 years after marrying Bess, which gave her only a brief time as his actual wife before she was back to being a dowager duchess, though at least she was a dowager duchess rather than a pensioner dependent on the charity of friends. So what do we make of Georgiana's story? It's not a dramatic tragedy like Mary Stuart's, with beheadings and prisons. It's not a public spectacle like Caroline Lamb's, with scenes and novels and open scandal. It's something quieter and possibly more depressing, the slow suffocation of a woman's happiness and health over decades of living in an impossible situation with no escape. Georgiana's tragedy was that she had everything the Georgian era claimed to value: beauty, social position, wealth, influence, and none of it could protect her from the basic reality that her husband had all the power and she had none. She couldn't make him love her. She couldn't make him stop sleeping with Bess. She couldn't keep her daughter Eliza. She couldn't even accumulate gambling debts without eventually facing his anger, while he could do whatever he wanted with no consequences. The love triangle at Devonshire House shows how Georgian marriage for the aristocracy was fundamentally broken in ways that destroyed the people trapped in it. The Duke got everything he wanted: a legitimate heir, a decorative wife who was a political and social asset, and a mistress he was genuinely fond of, all living together in an arrangement that met all his needs while meeting none of Georgiana's. Bess got security and eventually legitimacy, though at the cost of betraying her friend and living for decades in an ambiguous position. Georgiana got nothing except unhappiness, ill health, and the hollow satisfaction of having done her duty by producing an heir and maintaining appearances. What makes Georgiana's story particularly tragic is how much potential she had. She was intelligent enough to engage in complex political campaigning. She was creative enough to write poetry and to set fashion trends that influenced an entire era. She was charming enough to become one of the most famous women in England. If she'd been born in a different era, or if she'd been a man, or if she'd married someone who actually valued her, she could have been genuinely happy and accomplished. Instead, she spent her life managing the emotional fallout of her husband's infidelity, while trying to maintain a facade of glamour and success. The parallel to modern royal dramas is hard to miss. A beautiful, charismatic woman married to a cold, emotionally distant aristocrat, forced to share him with another woman, losing herself in compensatory behaviours like gambling, while maintaining a perfect public image. Georgiana's story is essentially a template for every unhappy royal marriage that would follow, and it shows that some patterns of aristocratic misery have remained remarkably consistent across centuries. The political dimension of Georgiana's life is also worth noting, because she was genuinely influential in Whig politics despite having no official role or power. She used her social position and personal charm to advance political causes she believed in, and she was effective at it. The fact that she had to do this while simultaneously managing the catastrophe of her personal life shows an incredible ability to compartmentalize, but it also shows how women in her position had to find ways to exercise power in a system that officially gave them none. Georgiana's gambling debts, which have often been portrayed as a character flaw or a sign of irresponsibility, look different when you understand them as a coping mechanism for unbearable stress. She couldn't control her marriage, but she could control whether she placed a bet. She couldn't make the Duke care about her, but she could lose herself in the excitement of cards and dice. The debts were a problem, but they were a symptom of deeper problems that had no solution within the constraints of Georgian marriage and society. The relationship between Georgiana and Bess remains one of the most psychologically complex aspects of the story. How do you maintain a friendship with someone who's sleeping with your husband? How do you live in the same house with them for decades? How do you act as if everything is normal when it's absolutely not? Georgiana managed it somehow, whether through genuine forgiveness, through desperate need for female companionship in her isolated life, through psychological compartmentalization, or through simple resignation to a situation she couldn't change. Whatever the mechanism, the fact that she maintained any relationship with Bess at all is remarkable, and speaks to both the constraints she lived under and her capacity for enduring impossible situations. The Duke's role in all this is perhaps the most infuriating. He doesn't seem to have been actively malicious. He didn't beat Georgiana or deliberately try to hurt her in the way that some Georgian husbands hurt their wives. He just didn't care about her feelings, didn't see anything wrong with openly conducting an affair with her best friend, didn't understand or care that the arrangement was destroying his wife. His indifference was in some ways worse than active cruelty would have been, because at least cruelty acknowledges that the other person exists and matters enough to hurt. The Duke's treatment of Georgiana suggested she didn't matter at all except as a function to be performed. This is what Georgian aristocratic marriage looked like at its worst. Not violent or dramatic, but hollow, treating people as tools for producing heirs and maintaining social position, rather than as human beings with feelings and needs. Georgiana was a tool for producing an heir and for enhancing the Duke's political influence through her social connections. When she'd served those functions, she was essentially useless to him, and he felt free to pursue his own happiness with Bess, while Georgiana could just cope with it however she managed. The fact that this arrangement was considered normal and unremarkable by Georgian standards tells you everything you need to know about how fundamentally broken the aristocratic marriage system was. People knew about the Duke and Bess. Everyone knew, and no one did anything because this was just how things were for aristocratic marriages that had produced the required heir. Love was something you found outside marriage if you were lucky, and if you weren't lucky, you just endured. Georgiana tried to find love with Charles Grey and lost everything she cared about as a result. Her lover, her daughter, what little happiness she'd managed to carve out of her life. The punishment for a wife having an affair was losing your child. The punishment for a husband having an affair was nothing. He could bring his mistress into his wife's home and make them all live together, and that was perfectly acceptable. The double standard was so extreme it was almost a parody of itself, but it was real, and women like Georgiana suffered under it every day. In the end, Georgiana Cavendish's story is a reminder that royal and aristocratic life in historical periods was not actually glamorous or enviable for most of the women living it. The beautiful dresses and the grand houses and the famous names concealed lives of quiet desperation, emotional abuse disguised as normal marriage, and women trying to maintain their sanity and dignity in situations designed to destroy both. Georgiana did it for 30 years before her body finally gave out from the strain, and even then her legacy was overshadowed by scandal and by the triumph of the woman who'd betrayed her. She deserved so much better than what she got. A better husband, a better friend, a better era to be born into. But she lived in Georgian England, married to a duke who treated her like furniture, betrayed by a friend she'd tried to help, and trapped by laws and social conventions that gave her no way out. That's the real tragedy of Georgiana Cavendish. Not that she lost dramatically, but that she lost slowly, quietly, over decades, while everyone watched and no one helped, because that's just how things were. And in some ways that quiet tragedy is more heartbreaking than any dramatic scaffold ending could ever be. If Georgiana's story showed us the slow suffocation of an aristocratic marriage, Queen Anne's relationships with her favourites show us something equally fascinating. How female friendship at the highest levels of power could transform into political warfare that shaped the fate of nations. This is the story of three women who were bound together by genuine affection, political necessity, and eventually by mutual hatred so intense it influenced everything from military appointments to international alliances. Welcome to the court of Queen Anne, where ladies' tea parties determined government policy and bedroom arguments ended political careers. Anne Stuart became Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1702, and she arrived at the throne with possibly the most depressing resume in royal history. She'd been pregnant at least 17 times, possibly 18. The historical record gets a bit unclear when you're dealing with that many pregnancies in an era with no reliable birth control and limited medical understanding. Of those 17 or 18 pregnancies, she'd had at least 12 miscarriages or stillbirths. 5 children were born alive, but 4 died in infancy or early childhood. Her longest surviving child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, made it to age 11 before dying of what was probably pneumonia in 1700, leaving Anne heartbroken and England without an heir. This was not, shall we say, an ideal situation for someone about to inherit multiple thrones. Anne was chronically ill, overweight, suffered from gout so severe she sometimes had to be carried in a chair, and was emotionally devastated by the loss of so many children. She was also not particularly clever or politically sophisticated. She meant well, but she wasn't going to be winning any prizes for strategic thinking or complex policy analysis. What Anne did have was stubbornness, a strong sense of duty, and a desperate need for emotional support and guidance from people she trusted. Enter Sarah Churchill, née Jennings, who would become Duchess of Marlborough, and who was, without exaggeration, one of the most formidable women in English history. Sarah was everything Anne wasn't: beautiful, intelligent, politically savvy, strong-willed to the point of being domineering, and absolutely convinced of her own rightness about everything. She'd been friends with Anne since they were both young girls, and that friendship had developed into something intense and all-consuming that historians still debate the exact nature of today. The relationship between Anne and Sarah began when Anne was still a princess and Sarah was a lady-in-waiting. They were complete opposites in personality, which sometimes creates the strongest friendships. Anne was pliant and emotional, Sarah was forceful and rational, and they seemed to complete each other in ways that neither could find elsewhere. They wrote each other letters constantly, using pet names to avoid the formality of their titles. Anne was Mrs. Morley and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman, which tells you something about the intimacy and informality of their relationship. The letters were affectionate, sometimes passionate in their language, and suggest a bond that went beyond normal court friendship. Were Anne and Sarah lovers in the physical sense? This is the question that's consumed historians and inspired numerous films and plays, most recently The Favourite, which portrayed them as having a sexual relationship. The honest answer is we don't know for certain, and will probably never know for certain, because people in the early 18th century weren't exactly documenting their sex lives for the benefit of future historians. What we do know is that their relationship was emotionally intense, that Anne was deeply dependent on Sarah, and that the language in their letters uses terms of affection and devotion that sound romantic to modern ears, though whether that's because the relationship was romantic or because 18th century friendship language was just more effusive than ours is open to interpretation. What's not open to interpretation is that Sarah had enormous influence over Anne, and she knew it. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah and her husband John Churchill, who would become the Duke of Marlborough, suddenly found themselves at the centre of power. John Churchill was made Captain General of British forces and became one of England's greatest military commanders. His victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and other battles essentially saved England during the War of Spanish Succession and made him a national hero. Sarah was made Groom of the Stole, Mistress of the Robes, and Keeper of the Privy Purse, which were the three most important positions in the Queen's household and which gave Sarah control over Anne's daily life, her wardrobe, and her finances. This was an incredible concentration of power in one couple, the husband commanding the armies, the wife controlling access to the Queen and managing her household. The Marlboroughs were Whigs, politically speaking, which meant they supported the war against France and opposed the Tory party's desire for peace negotiations. Through their influence over Anne, they could shape government policy, make or break political careers, and essentially run the country while Anne served as the figurehead who provided legitimacy to their decisions. For several years this arrangement worked well. Anne trusted Sarah completely. Sarah managed Anne's life and told her what to think about political matters. John Churchill won battles and covered himself and England in military glory. The government functioned, the war went well, and everyone seemed happy except the Tories, who resented being shut out of power by the Whig Marlborough faction. But there were cracks in the foundation, and those cracks centred on Sarah's personality and her treatment of Anne. Sarah was not a patient woman, and she was definitely not a tactful one. She believed she knew what was best for Anne and for England, and she had no hesitation about telling Anne so loudly and repeatedly. When Anne disagreed with her or wanted to do something Sarah disapproved of, Sarah would lecture her, scold her, and generally treat the Queen of England like a not very bright child who needed to be corrected for her own good. This is where Sarah made her fatal mistake. She forgot or stopped caring that Anne was the Queen and she was the subject. No matter how close their friendship, no matter how much influence Sarah had, no matter how dependent Anne was on her, there was a fundamental power imbalance that Sarah needed to respect. Anne had the ultimate authority. She could make or break anyone in the kingdom, and treating her with contempt, even in private, was a profoundly stupid thing to do if you wanted to maintain your position. But Sarah couldn't help herself. She believed she was indispensable to Anne, and she was probably right. Anne did need her, did depend on her, did value her opinion above almost anyone else's. But need and dependence don't mean someone enjoys being treated badly, and Anne was getting increasingly tired of being bullied by her best friend. She started to pull back emotionally, to be less effusive in her letters, to resist Sarah's advice more often. Sarah noticed this, and her response was to become more forceful and more critical, which made Anne pull back even more, which made Sarah even more frustrated and aggressive. It was a downward spiral that should have been obvious to everyone involved, but Sarah was too convinced of her own position to see it. And then Abigail Hill appeared and everything changed. Abigail was Sarah's cousin, impoverished through her father's bad financial decisions and working as a lowly servant when Sarah generously arranged for her to join Queen Anne's household as a lady of the bedchamber in 1704. This was an act of charity on Sarah's part, helping out a poor relation by giving her a position at court. It was also possibly the biggest tactical error Sarah ever made, because Abigail was about to replace her in Anne's affections and destroy everything the Marlboroughs had built. Abigail Hill, later Abigail Masham after her marriage, was in almost every way Sarah's opposite. Where Sarah was beautiful, forceful and domineering, Abigail was plain, quiet, and deferential. Where Sarah lectured and criticised, Abigail listened and agreed. Where Sarah had strong political opinions that she insisted Anne adopt, Abigail appeared to have no opinions at all except whatever Anne wanted to hear. She was perfect for a queen who was tired of being managed and criticised, and who wanted someone who would provide comfort without conflict. The shift in Anne's affections happened gradually. Abigail spent more time with Anne in private, helping with her various illnesses, providing companionship without demands, being reliably sympathetic and non-judgmental. Anne started confiding in Abigail instead of Sarah. She started asking Abigail's opinion instead of waiting for Sarah to tell her what to think. Sarah noticed this, of course, but initially dismissed it. Abigail was her poor cousin, a nobody, barely educated and with no political connections. How could she possibly be a threat to Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, most powerful woman in England below the Queen herself? But that dismissiveness was exactly why Abigail was such a threat. Sarah couldn't imagine that Anne might prefer someone less impressive, less intelligent, less forceful than Sarah herself. She couldn't conceive that Anne might be tired of being impressed with Sarah's intelligence and strength, and might want someone who didn't make her feel inadequate by comparison. And she definitely couldn't imagine that her poor cousin, whom she'd helped out of charity, would deliberately work to replace her in Anne's affections. Except that's exactly what Abigail was doing, and she was doing it brilliantly. Abigail understood something fundamental that Sarah had forgotten. Anne was the Queen, and what the Queen wanted was not political advice or management or lectures about her duties. What Anne wanted was comfort, sympathy, someone who made her feel valued and important rather than stupid and incompetent. Abigail provided exactly that, and in return she slowly, methodically displaced Sarah Churchill as the most important person in Anne's life. The political implications of this personal drama were enormous. Abigail was a Tory by family background and by personal conviction, unlike Sarah, who was passionately Whig. As Abigail's influence over Anne grew, Tory politicians suddenly found they had access to the Queen through Abigail. They could bypass the Marlboroughs and their Whig allies. They could present their arguments for ending the war with France, for dismissing Whig ministers, for changing government policy in ways that the Marlboroughs had blocked for years. Sarah realised what was happening by about 1707, which was several years after Abigail had begun her campaign, but still early enough that Sarah might have been able to salvage the situation if she'd handled it correctly. She did not handle it correctly. Instead of trying to win back Anne's affections through kindness and accommodation, Sarah went on the attack. She accused Abigail of scheming and manipulation. She demanded that Anne dismiss Abigail from her household. She wrote angry letters, made scenes, and generally confirmed everything that had made Anne tired of her in the first place. Anne refused to dismiss Abigail. This was a direct challenge to Sarah's authority, and to Sarah's assumption that she could control Anne's household and Anne's relationships. Sarah escalated, becoming more demanding and more critical. Anne responded by pulling further away and relying more heavily on Abigail for emotional support. The Marlboroughs' political enemies, sensing opportunity, used Abigail as a conduit to influence Anne against the Whigs and against the war policy that was making the Marlboroughs wealthy and powerful. The situation came to a head around 1708-1709, when Sarah's treatment of Anne became so overbearing that even Sarah's allies were embarrassed by it. There's a famous incident where Sarah supposedly kept Anne waiting at a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, then berated her loudly about her jewellery choices, reducing the Queen to tears in public. Whether this specific story is true or exaggerated, it captures the essence of how their relationship had deteriorated. Sarah treating Anne with open contempt, Anne humiliated but unable to directly confront Sarah, and everyone watching this dysfunctional relationship play out on the public stage. Anne finally found the courage to break with Sarah in 1710-1711. It wasn't sudden. There was no dramatic confrontation or final scene. Instead, Anne simply stopped responding to Sarah's letters, stopped seeing her privately, stopped giving her the access and influence she'd had for decades. Sarah was devastated and furious. She couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, she'd been a loyal friend, had given Anne good advice, had dedicated her life to supporting Anne's reign. The fact that she'd done all of this while treating Anne like an incompetent child who needed constant correction apparently didn't occur to her as a possible problem. Sarah tried everything to regain her position. She wrote letters, she demanded meetings, she threatened to publish Anne's correspondence to her, which was essentially political blackmail and which showed how completely Sarah had lost perspective on her situation. Threatening to embarrass the Queen of England by publishing her private letters was not a strategy that was likely to result in reconciliation, but Sarah was desperate and angry and convinced that Anne was being manipulated by Abigail and by Tory politicians into abandoning her true friend. The Marlboroughs were gradually stripped of their positions and influence. John Churchill was dismissed from his military commands in 1711, ostensibly for misappropriation of public funds, though really because the Tories wanted him gone and Anne was no longer protecting him. Sarah lost her household positions. The couple essentially went into political exile, though they retained their wealth and their titles. The Whigs were out, the Tories were in, and Abigail Masham had won the most complete political victory possible. She displaced Sarah Churchill, ended the Marlborough dominance, changed government policy, and become the Queen's most trusted confidant and advisor. Except Abigail's triumph was shorter lived than Sarah's had been, because Anne died in 1714, just a few years after finally breaking with Sarah. Anne was only 49, but decades of poor health, grief over her lost children, and the stress of her reign had taken their toll. She died without any surviving children, which meant the throne passed to her distant cousin George of Hanover, who became George the Founder and who had absolutely no loyalty to Abigail Masham or to the Tory politicians who'd used Abigail to gain power. The Hanoverian succession meant the Whigs were back in power, the Tories were out, and suddenly all of Abigail's influence evaporated overnight. She retired from court, lived quietly with her husband, and died in 1734, largely forgotten except as a footnote to the greater story of Anne and Sarah's broken friendship. Sarah, meanwhile, lived until 1744, surviving both Anne and Abigail and spending her later years writing her memoirs and giving her version of events, which painted her as the loyal friend betrayed by an ungrateful queen and a scheming cousin. The fact that Sarah's own behaviour had contributed to her downfall apparently remained invisible to her until the end. So what do we make of this triangle of Anne, Sarah and Abigail? On one level, it's a story about the dangers of taking friendship for granted and of treating someone badly because you assume they'll always put up with it. Sarah believed she was indispensable to Anne, and she wasn't wrong. Anne did need her, did depend on her, did value their relationship. But Sarah's mistake was thinking that need and dependence meant she could treat Anne however she wanted without consequences. She forgot that Anne was the queen, and that however much Anne needed Sarah, Anne also had the power to replace her if Sarah became more trouble than she was worth. On another level, this is a story about how personal relationships at the royal court were never just personal, they were always political. Sarah's influence over Anne wasn't just about their friendship, it was about the Marlboroughs' political power and their ability to shape government policy. Abigail's displacement of Sarah wasn't just about providing better emotional support, it was about giving the Tories access to the Queen and changing the course of English policy on the war with France. The personal was political, and the political was personal, and trying to separate them was impossible. The question of whether Anne's relationships with Sarah and Abigail were romantic or sexual adds another layer of complexity. If they were romantic relationships, then the Anne-Sarah-Abigail triangle is essentially a love triangle, where the incumbent partner treated their lover badly. The lover found someone new who treated them better, and the incumbent partner was replaced. This narrative is compelling and makes emotional sense. It explains the intensity of Anne's attachment to Sarah, the depth of Sarah's devastation at being replaced, and the completeness of Anne's transfer of affection to Abigail. But even if the relationships weren't romantic in the sexual sense, they were certainly intimate and emotionally intense in ways that went beyond normal friendship or even normal favoritism. Anne needed these women in her life. She was lonely, in poor health, grieving her lost children, and trapped in a position of enormous responsibility that she wasn't particularly well equipped to handle. Sarah and Abigail provided emotional support, companionship, and guidance that Anne desperately needed and couldn't get elsewhere. The fact that this emotional intimacy was tangled up with political power and government policy made it more complicated and more consequential, but it didn't make it less real. Sarah's tragedy was that she couldn't adapt to Anne's changing needs. In the early years of Anne's reign, Anne needed someone strong and decisive who would tell her what to do and help her navigate the complexities of being queen. Sarah was perfect for that role. But as Anne grew older, as she gained experience in her position, as she became more confident and more tired of being managed, she needed something different. She needed support without control, companionship without criticism, someone who made her feel capable rather than incompetent. Sarah couldn't provide that, possibly because she genuinely believed Anne was incompetent and needed constant guidance, and possibly because Sarah's own personality made it impossible for her to be supportive without being controlling. Abigail understood what Anne needed and provided it, whether out of genuine affection, political calculation, or some combination of both. She gave Anne the emotional experience of being valued and respected, of making her own decisions, of being the queen rather than being Sarah Churchill's puppet. This was manipulative in its own way. Abigail was using Anne's emotional needs to gain power and to advance Tory political interests. But it was also giving Anne something she genuinely needed and wasn't getting from Sarah. The comparison to Georgiana's situation in the previous chapter is instructive. Both stories involve complicated triangular relationships at the highest levels of society, where personal feelings and political social power were inseparably intertwined. But where Georgiana had no power and was victimised by the Duke's infidelity and Bess's betrayal, Anne had ultimate power and used it to end a relationship that was making her unhappy. Anne could dismiss Sarah, could replace her with Abigail, could strip the Marlboroughs of their positions and power. Georgiana couldn't do any of those things to the Duke or Bess, because she was a Duchess consort with no independent authority, while Anne was a reigning monarch who could literally reshape the government if she wanted to. This is what made female monarchy different from female aristocracy in this era. Queens had real power that they could use to protect themselves and to control their own lives in ways that even the highest-ranking aristocratic women couldn't. Anne used that power to free herself from Sarah's dominance, even though doing so meant losing someone she'd been close to for decades, and even though it meant disappointing and angering one of the most powerful families in England. The fact that Anne was able to make this choice, however painful it was, shows how monarchy gave women options that other women didn't have. The political consequences of Anne's personal choices were significant. The Marlborough's fall meant changes in war policy, changes in government composition, changes in foreign alliances. John Churchill's military genius had been vital to England's success in the War of Spanish Succession, and his dismissal and the subsequent Tory peace negotiations arguably gave France better terms than they would have gotten if the war had continued under Churchill's leadership. Personal feelings between three women, Anne's exhaustion with Sarah, Sarah's inability to moderate her behaviour, Abigail's manipulation of Anne's emotional needs, shaped international politics and military strategy in ways that affected millions of people across Europe. This wasn't unique to Anne's reign, of course. We've seen throughout these stories how royal, romantic and emotional relationships had political consequences, but Anne's situation is particularly clear-cut. You can draw direct lines from the personal breakdown between Anne and Sarah to specific political changes and military decisions. It's a perfect illustration of how impossible it was to separate the personal from the political at royal courts, and how women's relationships with each other could be just as politically significant as their relationships with men. Sarah's memoirs, written in her later years, are fascinating documents because they show her complete inability to understand her own role in her downfall. She portrays herself as the loyal friend betrayed, the wise counsellor ignored, the victim of Abigail's scheming and Anne's weakness. She never seems to have grasped that her own behaviour, the lectures, the criticism, the demands, the assumption that Anne couldn't function without her guidance, had pushed Anne away and created the opening that Abigail exploited. Sarah remained convinced until her death that she'd been right about everything, and that the only problem was that Anne hadn't been strong enough or smart enough to recognise how right Sarah was. This is almost tragic in its self-deception. Sarah had genuine gifts. She was intelligent, politically astute, capable of understanding complex situations and making sound judgments. If she'd been able to combine those gifts with even a small amount of tact and emotional intelligence, she could have maintained her position and her influence over Anne for Anne's entire reign. But she couldn't see Anne as anything other than a weak vessel that needed to be filled with Sarah's wisdom, and that fundamental disrespect for Anne as a person and as a monarch destroyed their friendship and Sarah's political career. Abigail's story is less documented because she didn't write memoirs and she left fewer letters, but what we know suggests she was smarter politically than Sarah in one crucial way. She understood that her power depended entirely on Anne's goodwill, and she never made the mistake of thinking she was indispensable. She remained deferential, never presumed too much, and when Anne died and Abigail's position became untenable under the new Hanoverian regime, she retired quietly rather than fighting to maintain power she no longer had. This was the opposite of Sarah's approach, and while it meant Abigail's period of influence was shorter, it also meant she didn't destroy herself trying to hold on to something that was already gone. The Stuart court under Anne was the last time that female favourites would have this level of direct political influence in England. Future queens would have favourites and ladies-in-waiting, but the political system would evolve in ways that made it harder for individuals to have the kind of direct access and influence that Sarah and Abigail enjoyed. Anne's reign represented a particular moment when royal favouritism, female friendship, and political power intersected in ways that shaped national policy, and it's unlikely that exact combination will ever occur again in the same way. What makes Anne's story particularly poignant is how lonely she seems to have been throughout her life. She lost 17 children. Her husband, Prince George of Denmark, was by all accounts kind but ineffectual, and he died in 1708, leaving Anne to rule alone for the last 6 years of her life. Her sister Mary had died years earlier, and they'd been estranged before that over political differences. Her half-brother was the Catholic claimant to the throne living in exile, considered a threat to Anne's Protestant succession. Anne had no family she could rely on, no children to comfort her, no close relatives she could trust. In that context, her intense relationships with Sarah and Abigail make more sense. They were filling a void in Anne's life that family would normally fill. They were her emotional support system, her companions, her confidants. The fact that they were also political actors using their access to Anne for personal and factional gain doesn't negate the genuine emotional component of these relationships. Anne needed them, probably in ways that were unhealthy, and certainly in ways that made her vulnerable to being used. But the need was real, and the relationships, however complicated, were the closest thing to family that Anne had during much of her adult life. The tragedy is that both relationships ended badly. Anne and Sarah's friendship of decades ended in bitterness and recrimination, with Sarah spending the rest of her very long life insisting she'd been wronged and never understanding how her own behaviour had contributed to the breakdown. Anne and Abigail's relationship seems to have remained functional until Anne's death, but it's hard to say how much genuine affection was there versus how much was political calculation and mutual dependence. Anne died having lost Sarah, having never reconciled with her sister before Mary's death, having lost all her children, having outlived her husband. She was the Queen of England, one of the most powerful positions in the world, and she died essentially alone. The Anne-Sarah-Abigail triangle is ultimately a story about the price of power, the complexity of female friendship under political pressure, and the fundamental loneliness of monarchy. These three women were bound together by genuine affection, by political necessity, by emotional dependence, and eventually by betrayal and hatred. Their relationships shaped government policy, influenced military decisions, and changed the course of English history. And yet, at its core, this is a human story about women trying to navigate impossible situations while dealing with all the messy emotions: love, resentment, jealousy, grief, loneliness that humans have always dealt with, regardless of their political power or social position. Anne deserved better. She deserved children who survived, a husband she could truly rely on, friends who valued her for herself rather than for her power. Sarah deserved better. She deserved to understand how her own behaviour was pushing Anne away before it was too late to fix. Abigail probably got exactly what she deserved. A brief period of power and influence followed by comfortable obscurity when that power evaporated. But deserving and getting are two different things, especially in royal courts where personal feelings and political ambitions are so thoroughly entangled that separating them becomes impossible. In the end, the story of Queen Anne and her favourites is a reminder that women's relationships with each other have always been just as complex, just as intense, and just as politically significant as their relationships with men. The Anne-Sarah-Abigail triangle shaped England just as surely as Henry VIII's marriages or Elizabeth I's flirtations with her favourites, but it did so through female friendship turned into political warfare rather than through romance or sexual attraction. It's a different kind of royal relationship disaster, but it's no less consequential or tragic for being primarily about women's bonds with each other rather than about women's bonds with men. And it's a fitting addition to our tour through royal romantic and emotional disasters, because it shows that the ways royals could destroy themselves and others through their personal relationships weren't limited to heterosexual romance. Any intense emotional bond at the level of royal courts could become dangerous, could be weaponized, could shape politics and change history. Anne, Sarah, and Abigail proved that female friendship could be just as destructive, just as politically significant, and just as impossible to separate from the personal as any of the romantic disasters we've examined. Their story is the final piece of evidence that when you're royal, nothing about your personal life is ever really personal, and every relationship is potentially catastrophic if handled wrong. If Queen Anne's story showed us how female friendship could destroy political careers, the next two stories show us something slightly different: how royal women's choice of companions and their refusal to conform to expectations could trigger civil wars or reshape what it meant to be royal. We're jumping from the intimate triangle of Anne, Sarah, and Abigail to two very different women whose personal circles became political statements: Henrietta Maria of France, whose Catholic entourage helped spark the English Civil War, and Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter, who decided that sculpting nude models was more interesting than cutting ribbons at charity events. Let's start with Henrietta Maria, because if there's a cautionary tale about how bringing your entire friendship group to a foreign country and refusing to adapt to local customs can go catastrophically wrong, she's it. Henrietta Maria was born in 1609, the youngest daughter of King Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici, which meant she grew up in one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, surrounded by art, culture, and militant Catholicism. France at this point was officially Catholic, had fought wars over religion, and took its Catholicism very seriously in that particular French way, where religion and national identity were thoroughly intertwined. In 1625, at age 15, Henrietta Maria married Charles I of England, who just inherited the throne from his father James I. This was a political marriage designed to improve relations between England and France, and on paper, it should have worked. Charles was Protestant, but he was also deeply interested in art and culture, enjoyed theatre and music, and seemed like someone who could appreciate a French princess raised in one of Europe's most cultured courts. The problem was that England was Protestant, increasingly Puritan in its religious sensibilities, and deeply suspicious of Catholics in general, and French Catholics in particular. Henrietta Maria arrived in England with an entourage of about 400 people, which was excessive even by royal standards and which immediately created problems. These weren't just servants. They were French Catholic bishops, priests, ladies-in-waiting, advisors, and various hangers-on who saw themselves as Henrietta Maria's connection to her homeland, and as guardians of her Catholic faith. They spoke French, they practiced Catholic rituals openly, they made no effort to learn English or to integrate into English court culture, and they treated England as a temporary posting in an inferior foreign country, rather than as their new home. Parliament and the English people were not thrilled about this. England had been Protestant since Henry VIII's break with Rome nearly a century earlier, and suspicion of Catholics was baked into English identity by this point. The idea of a Catholic queen with a Catholic entourage practicing their religion openly at the English court was inflammatory, and the fact that Henrietta Maria made no effort to be discreet about her Catholicism made it worse. She had a Catholic chapel built, she attended Mass openly, she tried to convert English courtiers to Catholicism, and she generally behaved as if being Catholic was perfectly normal and acceptable, rather than potentially treasonous by English standards. Charles initially tried to manage the situation by being indulgent with Henrietta Maria, while also trying to reassure his Protestant subjects that he wasn't being influenced by his Catholic wife. This satisfied no one. Henrietta Maria felt he wasn't supportive enough of her religion and her French household. The English felt he was too lenient with Catholic practices at court, and Parliament, which was supposed to be giving Charles money to run the country, started using its financial leverage to demand that Charles get rid of Henrietta Maria's French entourage. In 1626, less than a year after the marriage, Charles finally did what Parliament wanted. He expelled most of Henrietta Maria's French household, sending them back to France. This was traumatic for Henrietta Maria, who was 16 years old, in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language, married to a man she didn't love yet, and now being forced to give up everyone who represented home and family to her. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but emotionally accurate, that Henrietta Maria smashed windows with her bare fists in rage and grief when she was told her French attendants were being sent away. Whether or not she actually smashed windows, she was definitely devastated and furious, and her relationship with Charles hit a low point that took years to recover from. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Henrietta Maria and Charles eventually developed a genuine love match, which was unusual for a royal arranged marriage, and which would end up being part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Over the next few years they grew close. They had children, eventually 9, though several died young. They shared interests in art and theatre. Charles was devoted to Henrietta Maria in ways that were unusual for kings, who typically had mistresses and paid minimal attention to their wives beyond producing heirs. Charles didn't have mistresses. He was faithful to Henrietta Maria, genuinely loved her, and increasingly relied on her advice and counsel. This would have been touching if Henrietta Maria's advice hadn't been consistently terrible for Charles's political position. She encouraged him to resist Parliament's demands for power sharing and financial oversight. She supported his appointment of Catholic sympathising bishops to high positions in the Church of England. She advocated for alliances with Catholic powers in Europe. She was basically telling Charles to do everything that would make him more unpopular with his Protestant subjects, and Charles, because he loved her and valued her opinion, listened to her more than he should have. By the late 1630s, Charles was ruling without Parliament. He dismissed them in 1629 and decided he didn't need them, which was both unconstitutional and financially unsustainable. Henrietta Maria supported this decision and encouraged Charles to see parliamentary opposition as treason rather than as legitimate political disagreement. She was gathering her own circle of Catholic and Catholic sympathising courtiers, creating a power base at court that was seen as foreign and threatening by English Protestants, and she was becoming increasingly influential over Charles, to the point where people started calling her the real power behind the throne. This all came crashing down in 1642 when the long-brewing conflicts between Charles and Parliament, between Protestantism and Catholicism, between royal authority and parliamentary power, finally erupted into civil war. The English Civil War was about many things: religious differences, constitutional questions about the limits of royal power, economic tensions, and decades of political mismanagement. But Henrietta Maria and her Catholic circle were significant contributing factors. Parliament's propaganda portrayed Charles as a weak king controlled by his Catholic queen, and they weren't entirely wrong. Charles did value Henrietta Maria's counsel, and that counsel had consistently pushed him toward positions that alienated his Protestant subjects. When the war started, Henrietta Maria fled to the continent, raising money and buying weapons for Charles's forces. She was actively involved in the military and political struggle, not just as a supporter, but as an active participant. She pawned the crown jewels to buy arms. She negotiated with foreign powers for support. She was everything that English Protestants feared in a Catholic queen: politically active, willing to involve foreign Catholic powers in English affairs, and utterly committed to her husband's cause regardless of the cost to England. Charles lost the war, was captured, tried and executed in 1649, one of the few English monarchs to be legally executed by his own subjects. Henrietta Maria was in exile during this, unable to help him and devastated by his death. She spent the next decade in France, impoverished and dependent on charity, watching the English Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell completely reshape the country she'd briefly been queen of. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and her son Charles II took the throne, Henrietta Maria returned to England briefly, but she was no longer politically influential and no longer particularly welcome. She eventually returned to France and died there in 1669, having lived long enough to see everything she'd worked for collapse, and her husband executed partly because of the suspicion she'd helped create. Henrietta Maria's story is a reminder that being unwilling to adapt to your adopted country's culture and religion can have catastrophic consequences when you're a queen. She wasn't evil or malicious. She genuinely loved Charles, genuinely believed in her Catholic faith, and genuinely tried to support her husband. But her refusal to understand or accommodate English Protestant sensibilities, her insistence on maintaining a Catholic circle at court, and her political advice to Charles all contributed to the breakdown that led to civil war. She's a perfect example of how a queen's choice of companions and advisors can become a political liability that undermines the monarchy itself. Now let's jump forward 2 centuries to someone who rebelled against royal expectations in a completely different way. Princess Louise, 4th daughter of Queen Victoria, and a woman who looked at the suffocating protocol of the Victorian royal family and decided she'd rather hang out with artists and sculptors than with appropriate royal companions, thank you very much. Louise was born in 1848, right in the middle of Victoria's massive brood of 9 children. She was not the oldest, not the youngest, not the heir, not particularly sickly or remarkable. She was middle child incarnate, which probably contributed to her ability to carve out some independence, because Victoria wasn't watching her quite as obsessively as she watched the older children or the male heir. Louise was pretty, artistic, intelligent, and from a young age, clearly bored by the endless round of royal duties and court protocol that filled her mother's life. Victoria's court was, to put it mildly, not known for being fun. After Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria went into mourning that lasted basically the rest of her life. 40 years of wearing black, avoiding public appearances, and treating the court like a permanent funeral. The princesses were expected to be Victoria's companions, helping her with correspondence, attending her, providing emotional support while Victoria grieved her dead husband with an intensity that would concern any modern therapist. It was suffocating and Louise hated it. So Louise did something radical for a Victorian princess. She pursued actual interests and developed actual skills beyond the decorative accomplishments considered suitable for royal women. She became a serious sculptor, studying at the National Art Training School, which was completely unprecedented for a princess. Royal women didn't study art in school with common people. They had private tutors who taught them to paint pretty watercolours of flowers. They didn't work with clay and marble, they didn't study anatomy to better represent the human form, and they definitely didn't sculpt nude figures, which required looking at naked bodies in ways that proper Victorian ladies absolutely were not supposed to do. Louise did all of these things. She was genuinely talented. Her memorial statue to Queen Victoria in Kensington Gardens still stands today, and it's actually good work, not just good for a princess, but legitimately skilled sculpture. She exhibited her work publicly, sometimes anonymously to avoid trading on her royal status. She took her art seriously in a way that went far beyond royal hobby collecting, and this brought her into contact with the Victorian art world, which was a lot more bohemian and a lot less respectable than anything Victoria approved of. Louise's circle of friends included artists, writers, and intellectuals who definitely did not meet Victoria's standards for suitable royal companions. These were people who questioned social conventions, who had unconventional relationships, who valued creativity over propriety. There were rumours, never proven but persistent, that Louise had affairs with some of these artist friends, including her sculpture tutor, Joseph Edgar Boehme. The rumours were probably fuelled partly by Victorian scandal-mongering and partly by the fact that Louise did spend a lot of time in artists' studios, often unchaperoned, which was shocking behaviour for a princess regardless of whether anything sexual was actually happening. Victoria was not thrilled about any of this. She wanted her daughters to marry well and to be conventional royal wives, preferably staying close to her so she could continue to use them as unpaid secretaries and companions. Louise eventually did marry in 1871, John Campbell, Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll, but it was not a happy marriage. Lorne was Scottish nobility rather than foreign royalty, which was unusual, and there were persistent rumours that he was gay, and that the marriage was essentially a business arrangement that gave Louise a title and social cover while giving Lorne royal connections. They had no children, lived largely separate lives after the first few years, and by all accounts had minimal affection for each other. But the marriage did give Louise something valuable: independence from her mother. As a married woman, she could maintain her own household, make her own decisions about her social circle, and pursue her artistic interests without Victoria constantly trying to control her. She and Lorne spent several years in Canada while he served as Governor-General, which removed Louise even further from Victoria's direct supervision. When they returned to England, Louise lived largely apart from Lorne, maintained her connections with the artistic community, and continued sculpting and supporting various artistic causes. Louise was also progressive in her politics in ways that scandalised the more conservative members of the royal family. She supported women's education, was interested in the women's suffrage movement, supported various social reform causes, and generally behaved as if being royal meant she should use her position to support progressive change rather than to uphold traditional hierarchies. This was radical stuff for a Victorian princess, and it brought her into contact with suffragettes, reformers, and political activists, who were definitely not the sort of people Victoria wanted her daughters associating with. The fascinating thing about Louise is how she managed to carve out this space for herself, while still technically conforming to royal expectations. She didn't refuse to perform royal duties. She attended the necessary functions, cut the ribbons, made the appearances. She just also pursued a whole other life that had nothing to do with being royal, and she did it in ways that pushed boundaries without quite breaking them enough to create the kind of scandal that would have forced her back into line. She was essentially living a double life, princess in public, bohemian artist in private, and she maintained this balancing act for decades. Louise's choice of companions and her artistic circle were political statements in their own right. By associating with artists and intellectuals, by pursuing a career in sculpture, by supporting progressive causes, she was implicitly critiquing the suffocating conventions of Victorian royalty and aristocracy. She was showing that there were other ways to be a princess, other ways to use royal privilege, other ways to live a meaningful life beyond producing heirs and looking decorative at court functions. Victoria didn't particularly approve, but by the time Louise was established in her independent life, Victoria was old and tired and had bigger problems to worry about than one daughter who preferred sculptors to suitable society. Louise outlived Victoria by nearly 40 years, dying in 1939 at age 91, having lived through the entire transformation of British society from Victorian rigidity to the more relaxed social norms of the 20th century. By the time she died, her bohemian artistic connections that had seemed so scandalous in the 1870s were almost quaint, and younger generations of royals were pushing boundaries in ways that made Louise's mild rebellions look positively conservative. So what connects these two very different women? Henrietta Maria with her Catholic entourage in the 1630s, and Princess Louise with her artistic circle in the 1870s. Both were royal women whose choice of companions became statements about who they were and what they valued, and both faced criticism and conflict because those choices didn't align with what their societies expected from them. Henrietta Maria's French Catholic circle was seen as threatening because it represented foreign influence and religious difference in a country that was fiercely Protestant and suspicious of Catholics. Her companions weren't just her friends, they were symbols of everything that English Protestants feared about having a Catholic queen. The personal became political because Henrietta Maria's choice of companions directly challenged English national and religious identity. Louise's artistic bohemian circle was seen as scandalous because it represented a rejection of Victorian propriety and conventional femininity. Her companions weren't just her friends, they were symbols of creative freedom, intellectual questioning, and social reform that challenged Victorian values. The personal became political because Louise's choices about who she spent time with and what she chose to do with her life were implicit criticisms of the narrow, constrained roles that Victorian society assigned to women, especially royal women. Both women faced consequences for their choices, though Henrietta Maria's consequences were obviously far more severe. She helped trigger a civil war and saw her husband executed. Louise faced gossip, disapproval from her mother, and persistent rumours about her private life, but she retained her position and her privileges and lived to a ripe old age as a respected if somewhat eccentric royal. The difference in outcomes reflects partly the different severity of their choices. Religion and politics in the 17th century were literally life and death issues, in ways that artistic bohemianism in the 19th century wasn't, and partly the different positions they held. Henrietta Maria was queen consort with potential political influence over the king. Louise was a non-inheriting princess with no formal power, which made her less threatening and gave her more room to be unconventional. But both stories show how royal women's personal circles were never just personal. They were always being watched, always being interpreted as political statements, always subject to criticism and control from people who saw those circles as threats to stability, propriety, or national identity. Even in the most intimate aspects of their lives, who they befriended, who they spent time with, what they did in private, royal women were public figures whose choices had public consequences. Henrietta Maria probably never fully understood how threatening her Catholic entourage appeared to English Protestants. From her perspective, she was just maintaining her faith and surrounding herself with people who shared her culture and language in a foreign country. She couldn't see that from the English Protestant perspective. She was creating a Catholic power centre at the heart of English government, a potential avenue for foreign influence, and a living symbol of everything they'd fought against during the Reformation. Her inability or unwillingness to understand this English perspective contributed to the catastrophe that followed. Louise, on the other hand, seems to have understood exactly how her choices appeared to Victorian society. She just didn't care enough to change her behaviour. She knew her artistic pursuits and her bohemian friends scandalised people. She knew the rumours about her private life damaged her reputation. She just valued her freedom and her art more than she valued conforming to expectations, and she calculated correctly that as a non-inheriting princess she had enough privilege to get away with it, as long as she didn't push things too far. This is the key difference between them. Henrietta Maria couldn't see the problem with her choices until it was too late, while Louise saw the problem but decided it was worth it. Henrietta Maria was naive or sheltered or genuinely unable to understand how her Catholicism and her French circle appeared to English Protestants. Louise was deliberately choosing to challenge Victorian conventions because she found them stifling and because she valued other things more than royal conformity. The outcomes reflect these different approaches. Henrietta Maria's naivete contributed to civil war and the execution of her husband, after which she spent decades in impoverished exile. Louise's calculated rebellion allowed her to live the life she wanted while maintaining her royal position, and dying peacefully in her 90s, having accomplished significant artistic work. If you're going to rebel against royal expectations, Louise's approach, understanding the costs, staying within certain boundaries, and knowing exactly how far you can push, is demonstrably more successful than Henrietta Maria's approach of seemingly not realizing there's anything to rebel against until everything explodes. Both women also show how female royal agency could manifest in different ways. Henrietta Maria exercised agency by refusing to give up her Catholicism and her French cultural identity despite living in Protestant England. This was brave in its way, even if it was politically catastrophic. She knew what she believed and what mattered to her, and she wasn't willing to compromise those things even when compromise might have saved her husband's throne and life. Whether this makes her principled or stubborn or simply unable to see beyond her own perspective is an open question, but it was definitely a form of agency. Louise exercised agency by carving out a life for herself that had nothing to do with being royal, by pursuing real accomplishments in sculpture, and by associating with people who valued her for her artistic talent rather than for her title. This was also brave, in the quieter way of someone who knows she's being judged and criticized but chooses to pursue what matters to her anyway. Louise's rebellion was less dramatic than Henrietta Maria's, but possibly more radical in its implications. She was questioning the entire premise of what it meant to be a royal woman, suggesting through her actions that royal women could have talents, interests and accomplishments beyond their reproductive and decorative functions. The tragedy of Henrietta Maria is that her inability to adapt to English culture and her political influence over Charles contributed to a catastrophe that destroyed the monarchy temporarily and cost her husband his life. She loved Charles genuinely, wanted to support him, and thought she was helping him by encouraging him to stand firm against Parliament and to resist compromise. She couldn't see that she was actually isolating him, making him seem foreign-influenced and potentially tyrannical, and contributing to the political breakdown that led to war. The triumph of Louise is that she managed to be genuinely accomplished and genuinely unconventional, while remaining within the royal family and maintaining her position and privileges. She didn't have to choose between being royal and being herself. She figured out how to be both, even if it meant enduring gossip and criticism. By the time she died in 1939, she'd lived through World War I, the end of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, massive social changes, and the beginning of World War II. She'd outlived most of her siblings, outlived Victoria by nearly 4 decades, and had lived to see women get the vote and many of the social reforms she'd quietly supported decades earlier. Both women also remind us that royal women's choices about their personal circles and companions weren't just about individual preference. They were about identity, values, and what kind of future they wanted to see. Henrietta Maria's Catholic circle represented her commitment to her faith and to her French identity, which she wasn't willing to give up even when that commitment had catastrophic political consequences. Louise's artistic circle represented her commitment to creative expression, intellectual freedom, and social progress, which she pursued despite knowing it would scandalize conventional society. In both cases, these weren't just random friendship groups. They were carefully chosen communities that reflected and reinforced the women's identities and values. Henrietta Maria surrounded herself with people who would support her Catholic faith in a hostile Protestant country. Louise surrounded herself with people who valued artistic talent and intellectual engagement over social rank and convention. Your companions define you, especially when you're royal and everyone is watching who you spend time with, and both Henrietta Maria and Louise understood this on some level and chose companions who aligned with their values, even when those choices came with significant costs. The comparison between these two women also highlights how much changed between the 1630s and the 1870s in terms of what royal women could get away with. Henrietta Maria's Catholicism and foreign entourage helped trigger a civil war because religion and national identity were literally worth fighting over in the 17th century. Louise's artistic pursuits and bohemian friends caused scandal, but not political crisis, because by the late 19th century, British society had other problems to worry about, and one eccentric princess wasn't going to bring down the monarchy. This shows both social progress. People weren't going to fight wars over whether a princess could sculpt nude figures, and also the declining political importance of the monarchy by the Victorian era. Henrietta Maria mattered politically because kings and queens still had real power in the 1630s, and who influenced them was genuinely important to national governance. Louise didn't matter politically regardless of who she associated with, because by the 1870s, the British monarchy was already largely ceremonial, and princesses had no formal political role. But both women would probably have argued that they mattered in ways beyond formal politics. Henrietta Maria saw herself as defending her faith and supporting her husband in what she believed was a righteous cause. Louise saw herself as expanding possibilities for women and demonstrating that royal women could have meaningful accomplishments beyond their traditional roles. Whether they succeeded in these goals is debatable, but both were trying to use their positions and their choices of companions to advance values they believed in, even when those choices came with significant personal and political costs. In the end, Henrietta Maria and Princess Louise represent two different types of royal rebellion through companion choice. Henrietta Maria's choice to maintain a Catholic French circle in Protestant England was a rebellion through maintaining identity, refusing to give up who she was even when her adopted country demanded assimilation. Louise's choice to pursue art and associate with bohemians was a rebellion through expanding identity, refusing to be limited to the narrow roles assigned to Victorian princesses and insisting on being recognised as an artist and intellectual as well as a royal. Both faced criticism, scandal and conflict. Henrietta Maria's consequences were more severe: civil war, her husband's execution, exile, while Louise's were more manageable: gossip, maternal disapproval, persistent rumours. But both were exercising agency in choosing their companions and their circles, both were making political statements through those personal choices, and both were demonstrating that royal women, however constrained by their positions, could still find ways to assert their identities and values through the company they kept, and the lives they chose to live within the constraints they couldn't escape. If Princess Louise showed us how a royal woman could quietly rebel against convention while maintaining her position, Caroline of Brunswick shows us what happened when a queen decided that if society was going to treat her badly anyway, she might as well do whatever she wanted and scandalise everyone in the process. This is the story of a woman who went from being Princess of Wales to being physically barred from her own husband's coronation, and whose relationship with an Italian servant became one of the greatest royal scandals in British history. It's also a story about the most dysfunctional royal marriage outside of the Tudor era, and that's really saying something. Caroline of Brunswick was born in 1768, daughter of the Duke of Brunswick and Princess Augusta of Great Britain, which made her a cousin of the British royal family. She grew up in Brunswick, which was a small German state, and by all accounts she was raised with minimal supervision, limited education, and absolutely no training in the kind of refined social behaviour that would be expected of someone who married into the British royal family. Her parents apparently believed that letting Caroline do whatever she wanted was fine, which meant she developed habits and behaviours that would later scandalise British court society and give her husband ammunition for decades of complaints about her unsuitability. The problem was that Caroline's behaviour wasn't actually that bad by normal human standards. She was just honest, direct, informal, and unconcerned with rigid court protocol. She said what she thought. She laughed loudly. She was affectionate with people. She wasn't interested in spending hours on her appearance or in following the complex rules about who could speak to whom and in what order that governed Georgian court life. In a different context or a different era, she might have been seen as refreshingly down-to-earth. In Georgian England, married to possibly the most protocol-obsessed prince in Europe, she was seen as vulgar, inappropriate, and embarrassing. Which brings us to George, Prince of Wales, who would eventually become George IV and who was, without exaggeration, one of the worst people ever to inherit the British throne. George was vain, selfish, extravagant, perpetually in debt despite having enormous income, obsessed with fashion and appearance, and completely lacking in any sense of responsibility or duty. He'd spent his 20s and 30s having affairs, building the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, collecting art, gambling away fortunes, and generally behaving like someone whose only purpose in life was to demonstrate that having unlimited money and no real responsibilities turned people into monsters. By 1794, George was 32 and desperately needed to marry, not because he wanted a wife, but because he was so deeply in debt that Parliament was refusing to increase his income unless he did his duty and produced an heir. George was already secretly and illegally married to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, but that marriage didn't count legally because of the Royal Marriages Act and because she was Catholic, which meant any children from that marriage couldn't inherit the throne. So George needed a legal Protestant wife who could give him legitimate children, and he needed her quickly so Parliament would bail him out of his self-inflicted financial disaster. George's choice of bride was Caroline of Brunswick, selected primarily because she was Protestant, of appropriate rank, and available. George had never met her, didn't particularly care who she married as long as Parliament paid his debts, and seems to have put about as much thought into choosing a wife as most people put into choosing what to have for breakfast. Caroline, for her part, was 26 and probably saw the marriage as an opportunity to become Princess of Wales and eventually Queen of England, which was a significant step up from being a minor German princess in Brunswick. Neither of them had any illusions that this was a love match, but they probably didn't anticipate just how catastrophically incompatible they would turn out to be. Caroline arrived in England in April 1795, and the marriage was doomed from the moment George first saw her. According to accounts, George took one look at Caroline, turned pale, asked for brandy, and later complained to one of his friends that she was nothing like her portrait, and that he found her personally repulsive. Caroline, for her part, apparently thought George was fat, which he was, and was unimpressed by his vanity and his obvious disappointment at her appearance. This was not an auspicious beginning. They were married 3 days after meeting, which didn't give them any time to develop even a minimal rapport. According to various accounts, George was drunk at the wedding. He reportedly had to be held upright during the ceremony, and spent the wedding night passed out in the fireplace of the bridal chamber. This is possibly the least romantic wedding night in royal history, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Somehow, despite George's apparent repulsion and the disaster of a wedding night, Caroline got pregnant almost immediately. She gave birth to Princess Charlotte in January 1796, 9 months after the wedding, which fulfilled George's obligation to produce an heir and meant he no longer had any reason to maintain even the pretense of a marriage with Caroline. He moved out of their shared apartments almost as soon as Charlotte was born and essentially abandoned Caroline, making it clear that as far as he was concerned, the marriage was over, except on paper. Caroline was left in an impossible position. She was Princess of Wales, technically second-ranking woman in the kingdom after the Queen, but she had no money of her own beyond a small allowance from Parliament, minimal access to her daughter Charlotte, and a husband who hated her and who used his influence to make sure she was socially isolated at court. She couldn't divorce George. Divorce for royals was essentially impossible, and even if it weren't, she'd lose any access to Charlotte and any financial support. She couldn't leave England without permission. She was trapped in a marriage that didn't exist except to keep her trapped. George, meanwhile, went back to Maria Fitzherbert and his various other mistresses, spent money he didn't have on his building projects and his art collection, and encouraged everyone at court to ostracize Caroline. He spread rumours about her behaviour, her hygiene, her manners, anything he could think of to justify his treatment of her. He was essentially conducting a decades-long character assassination campaign against his own wife, and because he was the Prince of Wales and would someday be king, people at court went along with it, even when they privately thought he was being unreasonable. Caroline responded to this situation by deciding that if she was going to be treated as scandalous and inappropriate anyway, she might as well actually be scandalous and inappropriate. She set up her own household at Montague House in Blackheath, gathered around her a circle of artists, eccentrics, and people who'd been rejected by polite society, and generally behaved as if she didn't care what anyone thought of her. She wore eccentric clothing. She made jokes that shocked people. She was informally affectionate with her guests in ways that fueled rumours about affairs. She essentially performed the role of outrageous rejected princess with enthusiasm, which gave George more ammunition, but also gave Caroline some agency and some enjoyment in an otherwise miserable situation. The rumours about Caroline became increasingly wild. People claimed she'd had multiple affairs. There were whispers that she'd had an illegitimate child. The delicate investigation of 1806 was a formal inquiry into whether Caroline had given birth to a son, which would have been treason. The investigation concluded she hadn't, but it damaged her reputation and showed how far George was willing to go to destroy her. He wanted her to be guilty of something, anything, that would justify him in setting her aside officially. But despite his best efforts to find or manufacture evidence, Caroline managed to avoid giving him the clear-cut scandal he needed. Then, in 1814, George's mother, Queen Charlotte, died, which changed the dynamics at court, and more importantly, Princess Charlotte, Caroline's daughter, turned 18 and began actively supporting her mother against her father. Charlotte hated George for his treatment of Caroline, and she was popular with the public in ways that George absolutely wasn't. This gave Caroline some protection and some support, but it also increased the tension between Caroline and George to the point where something had to break. In 1814, Caroline made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She left England. George had been putting pressure on her to leave for years, and finally Caroline agreed, probably because staying in England meant continued social ostracism, constant surveillance, and a never-ending battle with George. She went to the continent, travelling through Italy, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and she took with her a small household including an Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami. Pergami, usually called Pergamy in English sources, was a former soldier who'd served in Napoleon's army. He was tall, handsome in that particular Italian way that English ladies found exotic and fascinating, and he started as Caroline's courier, basically a combination of guide, translator, and fixer who helped her navigate travel in foreign countries. Caroline was in her mid-40s at this point, no longer young, never conventionally beautiful even at her best, estranged from her husband and daughter, and essentially alone in the world except for the small entourage she'd brought with her. Pergamy was in his 30s, from a minor Italian family with no particular fortune or prospects beyond whatever employment he could find. The relationship between Caroline and Pergamy is one of those historical mysteries where we know something was happening, but the exact nature of it is lost to time and filtered through the hostile witnesses who later testified about it. What we know for certain is that Pergamy's role in Caroline's household expanded dramatically over the next few years. He went from being a courier to being her chamberlain, controlling access to her, managing her household and accompanying her everywhere. Caroline bought him a villa, promoted his family members into her service, and generally treated him as far more than a servant. They travelled together, sometimes with minimal chaperoning, through some of the most romantic locations in Europe and the Mediterranean. Witnesses later claimed to have seen them in compromising situations, sharing sleeping quarters on ships, being alone together in ways that suggested intimacy, behaving affectionately in public. Were they lovers? Almost certainly yes, though proving it beyond doubt is impossible because Caroline and Pergamy were never stupid enough to get caught in actual flagrante delicto, and the witnesses who later testified about their relationship all had motivations to exaggerate or lie because George was paying them to provide evidence of Caroline's adultery. But the weight of circumstantial evidence suggests that Caroline and Pergamy had a relationship that went beyond employer and servant, and that Caroline had finally found someone who treated her with affection and respect after decades of being rejected and vilified by her husband. From Caroline's perspective, this makes perfect sense. She'd been married to George for 20 years, abandoned by him after less than a year of marriage, subjected to decades of character assassination and social ostracism, prevented from seeing her daughter, and generally treated as if she were a criminal for the offence of being married to a man who hated her. If she found companionship and possibly love with Pergamy, it's hard to blame her. She was in her 40s, estranged from her family, living abroad with minimal supervision, and she'd already been treated as scandalous for years despite not actually doing anything scandalous. Why not actually have a relationship with someone who seemed to genuinely care about her? From George's perspective, Caroline's relationship with Pergamy was the gift he'd been waiting for. Clear evidence that Caroline was committing adultery, which would allow him to divorce her and remove her from any public role. He hired spies to follow Caroline and Pergamy throughout their travels, collecting testimony from servants, innkeepers, ship captains, anyone who had observed them together. He was building a case for divorce, planning to present it to Parliament and finally rid himself of the wife he'd never wanted. But before George could move forward with divorce proceedings, two things happened that changed everything. First, in November 1817, Princess Charlotte died in childbirth along with her baby. This was a national tragedy. Charlotte had been young, popular, and the heir to the throne, and her death meant the royal succession was suddenly unclear. It also meant that Caroline was no longer just the estranged wife of the Prince Regent. She was potentially going to be Queen Consort when George inherited the throne, because there was no obvious heir to supplant her claim to that position. Second, in January 1820, King George III finally died after years of madness, and George became King George IV. This made Caroline Queen Consort by default, whether George liked it or not, and it turned what had been a private marital disaster into a constitutional crisis. Could George prevent Caroline from being crowned? Could he divorce her as king when he hadn't been able to as Prince Regent? Could he exclude her from court and deny her the title and role of queen? Caroline, who'd been living abroad and apparently quite happy with Pergamy, decided she wasn't going to let George deny her the queenship. She left Italy and returned to England in June 1820, to a reception that shocked George. The public welcomed her enthusiastically, seeing her as the wronged wife standing up to her terrible husband. There were demonstrations in her support, newspapers defending her, and a general sense that whatever Caroline had done, George had done worse, and at least Caroline had the excuse of having been abandoned and abused by her husband first. George responded by doing exactly what Caroline probably expected. He demanded that Parliament pass a bill dissolving his marriage on grounds of Caroline's adultery with Pergamy. This led to the Pains and Penalties Bill, and subsequent hearings that turned into the biggest public spectacle in Regency England. The government had to present evidence of Caroline's adultery to the House of Lords, which meant weeks of testimony from spies, servants and witnesses describing Caroline and Pergamy's travels and their allegedly inappropriate behaviour. The testimony was explicit, salacious, and provided in exhaustive detail that was ostensibly about determining whether Caroline had committed adultery, but was really just public humiliation disguised as legal proceedings. Witnesses described Caroline and Pergamy sleeping in adjoining rooms with doors between them unlocked. They described seeing Caroline in Pergamy's arms. They described her wearing revealing clothing around him. They described finding them alone together at all hours. It was the Regency equivalent of reality television. Everyone was reading about it in the newspapers, taking sides, debating whether Caroline had done what she was accused of, and generally treating the whole thing as entertainment. Caroline's defence was essentially to point out that George had no moral standing to accuse her of adultery given his own behaviour, that many of the witnesses were unreliable and had been paid by George to testify against her, and that even if she had formed a relationship with Pergamy, she'd done so after George had abandoned her and after decades of his own open adultery with multiple women. This was a good defence legally and an excellent defence in the court of public opinion, because everyone knew George was a hypocrite and that he'd treated Caroline abominably for years. The bill passed the House of Lords, but with such a narrow majority and such obvious public opposition that the government withdrew it rather than sending it to the House of Commons, where it probably would have failed. This was technically a victory for Caroline. She wasn't going to be divorced or formally deprived of her title as Queen, but it was a Pyrrhic victory at best, because the testimony had destroyed what remained of her reputation, and George was more determined than ever to exclude her from any official role. The ultimate humiliation came in July 1821 at George's coronation. Caroline showed up at Westminster Abbey expecting to be crowned alongside George, because she was the Queen Consort and coronations traditionally included both King and Queen. She was turned away at the door, literally physically prevented from entering Westminster Abbey for her husband's coronation. She tried multiple entrances and was blocked at each one, creating a scene that was both humiliating and absurd. The Queen of England being denied entry to her own husband's coronation like some gatecrasher at a party. Caroline returned home from this humiliation and died less than 3 weeks later, on August 7, 1821. The official cause was some kind of intestinal blockage or obstruction, but she'd been ill for a while and the stress of the previous year's proceedings and the coronation humiliation certainly hadn't helped. She was 53 years old, had been married to George for 26 years, and had spent most of those years being publicly vilified by a husband who'd abandoned her after securing an heir. Her funeral procession through London turned into a riot when the government tried to prevent crowds from gathering to honour her, which tells you something about how much the public hated George and sympathised with Caroline despite all the scandalous testimony about her and Pergamy. So what do we make of Caroline of Brunswick and her relationship with Bartolomeo Pergamy? On one level, it's a straightforward story about a woman trapped in a terrible marriage who found companionship and possibly love with someone inappropriate by royal standards, and who paid a terrible price for that relationship. The relationship with Pergamy gave George the ammunition he needed to try to divorce Caroline and to exclude her from court, and it led directly to the humiliation of the Pains and Penalties hearings and Caroline being barred from the coronation. But on another level, Caroline's story is about agency and resistance. She was in an impossible position, married to a man who hated her, unable to divorce, socially ostracised, separated from her daughter, with no real options for building any kind of satisfying life within the constraints of her position. Her relationship with Pergamy was a way of claiming some happiness and some companionship despite all of that. It was a refusal to accept that her life had to be defined by George's rejection and by the royal family's contempt for her. The public's support for Caroline during the Pains and Penalties hearings and after her death shows that people understood this on some level. They could see that George was a hypocrite who treated Caroline badly for decades while conducting his own affairs openly. They could see that the legal proceedings were less about justice than about humiliating Caroline. They could see that whatever Caroline had done with Pergamy, it was done after George had abandoned her and after decades of his own adultery. The moral calculus didn't favour George, even if the legal rules about adultery technically did. Caroline's relationship with Pergamy also highlights the class dimensions of royal scandal. If Caroline had been rumoured to be having an affair with a nobleman or a foreign prince, it would still have been scandalous, but perhaps not quite so scandalous. The fact that Pergamy was a servant, from a minor family with no fortune or rank, made the relationship particularly shocking because it suggested Caroline had crossed not just sexual boundaries, but class boundaries. Queens weren't supposed to form romantic relationships with servants, no matter how estranged they were from their husbands. But Caroline apparently didn't care about these class boundaries, which is consistent with everything else we know about her personality. She'd never been good at respecting social hierarchies or following protocol. She'd always been more comfortable with informal relationships than with the rigid formality of court life. Falling for someone like Pagami, who treated her well and who apparently genuinely cared about her regardless of her royal status, makes perfect sense for someone who'd spent decades being treated badly by people who were supposedly her social equals. The comparison to earlier royal favourites and lovers is instructive. Elizabeth kept her favourites at arm's length emotionally and never let her personal feelings compromise her political position. Georgiana Cavendish found love with Charles Grey but lost her daughter and had to give up the relationship. Caroline Lamb destroyed herself pursuing Byron, who didn't really love her back. Caroline of Brunswick found companionship with Pagami and was barred from her own coronation as a result. The pattern across all these stories is that royal women who formed relationships outside the approved boundaries paid heavy prices, but Caroline of Brunswick's price was particularly visible and particularly humiliating because it played out in public hearings and ended with her being physically barred from Westminster Abbey. The tragedy of Caroline's story is that she was probably not a bad person, just someone who was incompatible with her husband and unwilling to pretend otherwise. If she'd been married to someone who actually liked her, or who was at least willing to be civil, she might have been a perfectly adequate princess and queen. She wasn't politically ambitious like Henrietta Maria, or intellectually rebellious like Princess Louise. She just wanted to be treated with basic decency and respect, and when she couldn't get that from her husband or from court society, she built a life for herself elsewhere and found companionship with someone who gave her what her marriage never had. George's behaviour throughout the entire saga was contemptible. He married Caroline purely for money, abandoned her immediately after securing an heir, spent decades trying to destroy her reputation, hired spies to follow her around Europe collecting evidence of adultery, subjected her to public humiliation in the Pains and Penalties hearings, and then barred her from his coronation. He was cruel, petty, vindictive, and completely lacking in any sense of honour or decency. The fact that he was eventually allowed to do most of what he wanted, excluding Caroline from court, preventing her from being crowned, humiliating her publicly, shows how little protection royal wives had from royal husbands who wanted to be rid of them. Caroline's death less than 3 weeks after being barred from the coronation suggests that the humiliation may have contributed to her final illness, or at least worsened it. She'd fought for years to be recognised as queen, had returned to England specifically to claim that title, and had been turned away at the door of Westminster Abbey in front of the entire nation. It's hard to imagine recovering from that kind of public rejection, especially for someone who'd already endured decades of rejection and vilification. But Caroline's legacy was complicated. The public sympathised with her and saw her as the wronged wife standing up to a terrible husband. Her funeral procession turned into a political demonstration against George IV. But her actual behaviour, the eccentricities, the informal manners, the relationship with Pagami didn't really challenge the system that had trapped her. She didn't argue that royal wives should have rights, or that women should be able to divorce abusive husbands. She just tried to build some happiness for herself within an impossible situation, and when that brought her into direct conflict with George, she fought back but ultimately lost. The relationship with Pagami remains one of those romantic mysteries where we'll never know the full truth. Was it a genuine love affair? Was Pagami using Caroline for money and position? Was Caroline using Pagami for companionship and possibly as a way to strike back at George? The answer is probably some combination of all of these things, because human relationships are complicated and motivations are mixed, and people in impossible situations often make choices that don't fit neatly into categories of good or bad, genuine or calculating. What we can say is that Caroline and Pagami had some kind of relationship that went beyond employer and servant, that this relationship gave George the weapon he needed to try to destroy Caroline completely, and that the public spectacle of the Pains and Penalties hearings and Caroline being barred from the coronation was the final act in a marital tragedy that had been playing out for 26 years. Caroline died having been denied even the symbolic recognition of being crowned queen, and George got to conduct his coronation without her. But the public sympathy was entirely with Caroline, and George's reputation never recovered from how he'd treated her. In the end, Caroline of Brunswick's story is a reminder that royal marriages could be prisons, that royal women had limited options for escaping those prisons, and that finding happiness outside an unhappy marriage could lead to public humiliation and constitutional crises. Her relationship with Pagami may have given her some years of companionship and possibly love, but it ultimately cost her any chance of being recognised as queen in anything more than name. She deserved better than George IV, better than being barred from Westminster Abbey, better than dying weeks after that final humiliation. But deserved and received remain two very different things for royal women, and Caroline's story is one of the clearest examples of just how wide that gap could be. If Caroline of Brunswick showed us what happened when a royal wife sought companionship outside a disastrous marriage in the 19th century, Diana Spencer shows us what that looked like in the 20th century, with one crucial difference: television cameras, tabloid newspapers, and a level of media scrutiny that made every private moment into public spectacle. This is the story of the most famous woman in the world trapped in the most analysed marriage in history, searching for love and authenticity while millions of people watched, judged, and projected their own hopes and disappointments onto her. Diana Frances Spencer was born in 1961 into an aristocratic family with close connections to the royal family. The Spencers had been around British royalty for generations, and Diana's family literally lived on the royal Sandringham estate. She grew up in privilege but also in dysfunction. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was young, her mother left, and Diana and her siblings were essentially caught in the middle of an ugly divorce and custody battle. This was not ideal preparation for becoming the most famous woman in the world, but then again, nothing could have actually prepared Diana for what was about to happen to her. In 1977, when Diana was 16, she met Charles, Prince of Wales, who was dating her older sister Sarah at the time. Charles was 28, heir to the throne, and under increasing pressure to find a suitable bride and produce heirs. The pressure was real. He was approaching 30, which was getting old for an unmarried heir, and the press was constantly speculating about his relationships and when he'd finally settle down. Charles had been in love with Camilla Parker Bowles for years, but she'd married someone else, and Charles needed to find someone suitable, which in royal terms meant someone young, aristocratic, without any previous relationships that could cause scandal, and willing to be moulded into the perfect princess. Diana, in 1980-81, when Charles started seriously courting her, fit all these requirements. She was 19, aristocratic, had no serious previous relationships, and seemed sweet, shy, and pliable, perfect raw material for the royal family to shape into whatever they needed her to be. Charles proposed in February 1981 after they'd known each other for about 6 months, which sounds romantic until you realise they'd spent very little actual time together and barely knew each other. Diana said yes, probably because refusing the future king wasn't really an option, and because she was 19 and caught up in the fairy tale of becoming a princess. The wedding in July 1981 was watched by 750 million people worldwide, which was an absolutely staggering number for the era, and which shows just how much global attention was focused on Diana from the very beginning. She looked like a fairy tale princess in her enormous wedding dress. Charles looked like someone who was fulfilling a duty rather than marrying someone he loved. And somewhere in the mix of pageantry and celebration was the reality that these two people barely knew each other, wanted different things from life, and were fundamentally incompatible in almost every way that mattered. The marriage started to go wrong almost immediately, which shouldn't have surprised anyone who'd been paying attention to the warning signs. Charles was 32, set in his ways, interested in things like architecture and organic farming and classical music. Diana was 20, still figuring out who she was, interested in popular music and fashion and romance novels. Charles wanted a wife who would quietly support him and produce heirs without demanding too much of his attention or interfering with his life. Diana wanted a husband who would love her, pay attention to her, and provide the emotional security she'd never had growing up in her fractured family. Making this mismatch worse was the fact that Charles had never really stopped loving Camilla Parker Bowles. She was still in his life, still his closest confidant, still the person he turned to for emotional support. Diana figured this out fairly quickly, which was devastating for someone who'd married expecting to be loved, and who instead found herself essentially the third person in her own marriage. The famous line from Diana's later interview, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," perfectly captured the impossible situation she was in. But Diana did her duty. She had 2 sons, William in 1982 and Harry in 1984, which secured the succession and fulfilled the primary purpose of the marriage from the royal family's perspective. She performed her royal duties, travelling with Charles, cutting ribbons, shaking hands, doing all the things that princesses were supposed to do, and she discovered that she was remarkably good at the public side of being royal. She had a natural warmth and empathy that came across in photographs and footage. She connected with ordinary people in ways that the rest of the royal family didn't, and she was becoming more famous and more beloved than Charles, which created its own tensions. By the mid-1980s, the marriage was essentially over in everything but appearance. Charles and Diana were leading increasingly separate lives, performing together in public while barely speaking in private. Diana was struggling with bulimia, depression, and self-harm, all responses to the impossible pressure she was under and the emotional abandonment she was experiencing. The royal family's response to Diana's mental health struggles was essentially to ignore them and to expect her to pull herself together and keep performing her duties, because admitting that the Princess of Wales was struggling would have required acknowledging that something was wrong with the marriage and with how the royal family treated its members. Diana's search for love and emotional connection outside her marriage needs to be understood in this context. She was trapped in a marriage with a man who didn't love her and who was still emotionally attached to his former girlfriend. She was struggling with her mental health, she had no real support system within the royal family, and she was desperate for someone to actually care about her as a person, rather than as a princess or a royal baby-making machine. James Hewitt entered Diana's life in 1986 as her riding instructor, because Diana wanted to overcome her fear of horses, and Hewitt was a cavalry officer who was recommended to teach her. Hewitt was handsome in that specific British military way, red-haired, charming, confident, and apparently capable of actually paying attention to Diana and making her feel valued. The affair started around 1986-87 and lasted until 1991, which was one of the longer relationships Diana had outside her marriage. Hewitt gave Diana what Charles wasn't giving her: attention, affection, someone who seemed genuinely interested in her. He made her feel attractive and desired at a time when her marriage had made her feel unwanted. The relationship was discreet initially, but in the small world of British aristocracy and military officers, discretion was always relative, and eventually people started to notice and to gossip. The affair became an open secret among people who moved in those circles, though it didn't become fully public until years later when Hewitt decided to write a book about it, which was about as classy as you'd expect from someone cashing in on an affair with the Princess of Wales. The Hewitt affair is often portrayed as Diana's great betrayal of Charles, which is darkly funny given that Charles had been having an affair with Camilla for the entire duration of his marriage to Diana. The double standard was breathtaking. Charles could maintain a decades-long relationship with his former girlfriend while married to Diana, but Diana having an affair with her riding instructor was seen as shocking and inappropriate. The hypocrisy was there for anyone who wanted to see it, though plenty of people chose not to see it because it was easier to blame Diana for not being a perfect princess than to acknowledge that she'd been placed in an impossible situation. After Hewitt came Hasnat Khan, and this is where Diana's story shifts from looking for affection to looking for something deeper and more meaningful. Khan was a Pakistani heart surgeon working in London, and Diana met him in 1995 when she was visiting a friend in the hospital. Khan was the opposite of everything Diana had known in her royal life. He was serious, dedicated to his work, uninterested in fame or attention, and had no connection to or interest in the aristocratic world Diana inhabited. He was also married to his career in a way that made a relationship with Diana complicated from the start. Diana apparently fell deeply in love with Khan, more so than with anyone else since her marriage to Charles. She called him Mr. Wonderful in conversations with friends. She visited him at the hospital wearing disguises to avoid being recognized by the press. She apparently wanted to marry him and was willing to convert to Islam if that would make it possible. This was a serious relationship for Diana in a way that Hewitt hadn't been. Khan represented not just affection, but the possibility of a completely different life, away from the royal family and the press attention, and all the things that had made Diana miserable for 15 years. But Khan was ambivalent about the relationship, at least according to most accounts. He cared about Diana, but he also saw the impossibility of their situation. He couldn't give Diana a normal life because she'd never have a normal life. She was the most famous woman in the world, and marrying her would mean giving up his privacy and his career in surgery for a life of media scrutiny. He also came from a traditional Pakistani Muslim family, and the idea of marrying a divorced Christian British princess who was mother to the future King of England was probably not going to go over well with his relatives. The relationship lasted about 2 years, until 1997, and by most accounts Khan ended it because he couldn't handle the pressure and the impossibility of their situation. Diana was devastated. She'd found someone she genuinely loved, someone who represented escape from everything that had made her unhappy, and he couldn't or wouldn't commit to her. It was another rejection in a life that had been full of rejections, and it came at a time when Diana was trying to rebuild her life after her divorce from Charles, which had been finalised in 1996. Which brings us to Dodi Fayed, and this is where Diana's story takes its tragic turn. Dodi was the son of Mohammed al-Fayed, the Egyptian billionaire who owned Harrods, and who had been trying for years to gain acceptance in British high society, and who saw a relationship between his son and Diana as a way to achieve that acceptance. Dodi himself was a film producer, wealthy, charming in a superficial way, and with a history of relationships with models and actresses that suggested he was more interested in being seen with beautiful women than in actual emotional connections. Diana started seeing Dodi in the summer of 1997, shortly after her relationship with Khan ended. The timing suggests this was at least partly a rebound relationship. Diana was hurt by Khan's rejection, and Dodi represented escape and luxury, and someone who actually wanted to be seen with her publicly, unlike Khan who'd insisted on discretion. The Al-Fayed family also provided Diana with vacations on yachts in the Mediterranean, which must have been a relief after years of royal protocol and British reserve. But whether Diana was genuinely in love with Dodi, or whether she was using the relationship to make Khan jealous, or to show the world that she could be happy without Charles, is one of those questions that will never have a clear answer, because Diana died before the relationship had time to develop into whatever it was going to become. The media speculation was intense. Were they engaged? Was Diana pregnant? Was she going to marry Dodi and convert to Islam? None of these questions could be answered definitively, and Diana's death meant they became frozen in speculation rather than evolving into actual outcomes. On August 31st, 1997, Diana and Dodi died in a car crash in Paris, fleeing from paparazzi photographers who'd been chasing them. The driver was drunk, speeding, and neither Diana nor Dodi were wearing seatbelts. 3 factors that combined with catastrophic results when the car crashed into a pillar in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Diana was 36 years old, had been divorced for just over a year, was finally starting to build an independent life for herself, and died because of a combination of aggressive paparazzi, reckless driving, and the tragic randomness of accidents. The aftermath of Diana's death was unprecedented in British history. The public grief was massive and overwhelming, with millions of people leaving flowers at Kensington Palace, crying in the streets, and treating Diana's death as a personal loss. The royal family's initially restrained response was seen as cold and uncaring, and for a moment it looked like the monarchy itself might be in jeopardy from public anger at how they'd treated Diana in life and death. Elizabeth II eventually made a public statement and agreed to a public funeral, and Diana was buried with royal honours that acknowledged her status as mother to the future king, even if she was no longer technically part of the royal family. So what do we make of Diana's relationships outside her marriage? With Hewitt, with Khan, with Dodi? They were clearly attempts to find the love and emotional connection that she'd never had with Charles. Each relationship represented a different kind of escape from the gilded cage that royal life had become for her. Hewitt represented physical affection and attention. Khan represented the possibility of a meaningful relationship with someone serious and grounded. Dodi represented luxury and the appearance of being loved publicly, which Diana had been deprived of in her marriage. But these relationships were also shaped and constrained by Diana's position in ways that made genuine connection almost impossible. She was the most famous woman in the world. Any relationship she had would be immediately public, analysed, gossiped about, and turned into tabloid fodder. The men she was involved with had to deal with not just Diana the person, but Diana the global icon, Diana the princess, Diana the mother of the future king. That's a lot of baggage to bring to any relationship, and it's not surprising that most of the men in Diana's life ultimately couldn't handle it. The comparison to Caroline of Brunswick is instructive. Both were women trapped in marriages to men who didn't love them, and who were openly involved with other people. Both sought companionship outside their marriages. Both were vilified for it, while their husbands' own affairs were tolerated or ignored. Caroline's relationship with Pagami led to Parlia,